Crocodile farming operations are common around Siem Reap in northwestern Cambodia. Families maintain large concrete pits behind their homes in which dozens of crocodiles live in shallow murky waters. These animals are raised primarily for their hides and meat, both of which fetch value locally and internationally. It's a lot more than you actually think. The enclosures are surrounded by high cement walls and heavy gates designed to separate people from the animals, and most of the time these barriers work. Now, the crocodiles often lie still beneath the surface of the water, appearing harmless. But the danger is real because only a single misstep is needed for a disaster. Behind one of the family's homes on the outskirts of Siem Reap, several of these enclosures sat in a row. A father managed them daily, so he was familiar with the feeding schedule, the gate mechanisms, and the low sound the crocodiles made when moving through the water. Now, these pits formed a big part of his livelihood and his family's routine. Inside the house, his wife cooked and cared for their 2-year-old daughter, Ram Rath Neri. The child often played near the back door, watching her father from a distance, but not going beyond the yard for obvious reasons. Now, one morning in June 2019 followed the same pattern as usual. The father was checking on the crocodile pits, and the mother was inside working on household chores. Now, the back door to the yard was open, letting in heat and light, but this was a horrible mistake, because at some point, their daughter slipped away unnoticed. The low hum of the machinery from nearby farms and the calls of birds filled the air, and no one noticed her leave the house. Now, behind the house, one section of the crocodile pit was covered only partially by a thin wooden plank. It was a temporary walkway used by the father to move along the edge of the enclosure, so it was not fixed in place and could not reliably support much weight. I want you to keep that in mind. Now, for whatever reason, probably curiosity, the little girl made her way toward that plank. She likely looked down into the water where the surface reflected the daylight and appeared calm and green. Then she stepped too far. The splash was loud enough for the father outside to hear almost immediately. He turned, and from where he was standing, he could see that something small and light-colored had fallen into that pit. And in that instant, he realized his daughter wasn't in sight, so he started running toward it. When he reached the edge of the enclosure, the water below was already erupting. The crocodiles that had been resting near the bottom surged upward, drawn by the vibration of the splash. The surface broke apart violently. Dozens of open jaws snapped shut on contact. The sound of flesh and bone colliding echoed off the solid concrete walls, and the forces of the bites tore through skin and muscle in an instant. The father screamed and grabbed anything nearby to fight them off. He hurled sticks and buckets into the pit, hoping to drive the crocodiles away, but the water had already turned red. The crocodiles were spinning, twisting with their prey in their jaws, executing what is called the death roll. Now, I'm not going to explain what that is because I'm pretty sure everyone already knows what that is. Neighbors heard the shouting and hurried to the yard, and what they witnessed was a scene of chaos. A crocodile pit thrashing violently, bodies colliding, tails hitting the wall, jaws emerging and submerging, pieces of clothing and a small hand breaking the surface before vanishing under the water. Some neighbors tried to intervene as well. They used long sticks to strike at the crocodiles but found it ineffective. The reptiles just rolled over each other in a frenzy. Their bodies collided as they bit and tore, the blood-slick water churning with foam and red. The air smelled of stagnant water and raw flesh, and when the motion finally stopped, the surface of the water was deeply stained red. Only a few scraps of clothing and some hair floated to one side. The crocodiles drifted motionless again, the yellow eyes just above the water surface. When the father reached down and retrieved what was remained of his daughter, the body had been mutilated beyond recognition. Her skull was crushed on one side, both arms severed, and her torso was torn open. He carried the remains out of the pit with his arms covered in blood. Witnesses say he was trembling and screaming, holding her shredded body wrapped in a thin cloth. Police and emergency workers arrived shortly afterwards, and when they entered, the scene was quiet except for the faint movement of crocodiles through the murky water. The father sat near the edge of the pit, soaked in blood, staring into the distance. Officers had to gently pull him away so they could proceed. The smell of blood and heat filled the air, with one officer describing seeing clumps of the girl's hair and torn fabric caught on the concrete lip of the enclosure. The medical report that followed documented the full extent of the trauma: crushing injuries to the skull and chest, deep tearing wounds consistent with multiple biting and underwater rotation. Investigators concluded that the death had occurred within seconds of the fall into the water. Measuring the enclosure, police found the wall to be about 3 feet high, insufficient to prevent a small child from climbing or falling over the edge. The wooden plank at the edge was splintered, its surface slick with water, although the back door from the house to the yard had been opened that morning, allowing the child to step outside. The mother was taken inside the home and treated for shock. Neighbors remained close, silent, and shaken. The investigation wound down, and by the evening the family had begun funeral preparations. The child's body was placed into a small white coffin, wrapped in a red and white cloth. Monks performed the traditional blessings. The authorities ruled the incident as an accident, so no criminal charges were brought. Officials released a statement reminding all crocodile farmers in the region to reinforce their barriers, keep gates locked, and remove unsecured boards or walkways from the enclosures. They emphasized that children must be kept well away from crocodile pits at all times. In early 2023, at the 3M manufacturing plant in Wisconsin, a longtime employee named Trisha Jones went to work as she always did. Now, the 3M facility is one of the largest employers in the area, producing industrial materials like adhesives, filters, and films. It's a massive complex, so a series of long metal buildings filled with machinery that runs almost non-stop. Now, inside the environment, it's hot and loud. The air kinda smells like oil and chemical solvents. Conveyor belts and rollers moved in constant rhythm, and heavy presses pound through layers of material. Each machine is built for precision but operates with immense power, so enough to flatten, shear, or crush anything that gets caught in its path. Workers in that environment live by strict procedures. The most important one is called lockout/tagout. It's meant to make sure a machine is fully powered down and secured before anyone touches or inspects it. Every employee is trained on it. It's the rule that separates maintenance from disaster. Now, Trisha Jones had been working at 3M for years, so she knew the routines, the equipment, and the safety rules. Her job that morning involved monitoring and maintaining part of a roller line, a machine that presses large sheets of adhesive material through 2 massive steel cylinders. Each roller weighs hundreds of pounds and spins fast enough to crush bone or even steel tools if caught in the gap. Now, the day started off quite normal. Trisha arrived for her shift, put on her gloves, and checked in the machines in her section. For hours, everything ran smoothly. Then sometime before noon, one of the roller systems began to slow, possibly from a small jam or even a misfeed. It wasn't unusual. Most of the time a quick check or a minor adjustment could fix it. Now, Trisha approached the roller assembly to take a look, but the machine hadn't been completely powered down, so the rollers were still turning, although slow but still active. She leaned forward to see what was wrong, maybe to pull a piece of the material free or adjust something near the feed point. And that's when it happened. They think her jacket sleeve brushed against the edge of the moving roller, and this contact was instant. The spinning steel grabbed the fabric and wound it tight in less than a second. Before she could even react, it yanked her arm forward with tremendous force. The sound that followed was muffled beneath the roar of the other machines. A dull, heavy thud mixed with a high-pitched whine of friction. Her body slammed against the front of the machine as the roller continued to pull. Her shoulders dislocated instantly, and the skin on her arm tore as the fabric and flesh twisted together. She screamed and tried to brace herself against the housing, but the machine just didn't stop. The roller dragged her in further, crushing her arm up to the shoulder, then pulling her torso tight against the cylinders. The pressure forced blood and tissue out around the contact point. Her chest compressed under the mechanical weight, with her ribs snapping one after another. Her head hit the steel frame hard enough to fracture her skull. Nearby workers turned at the sound of the scream, and what they saw stopped them cold. Trisha's upper body was half inside the machine, her legs kicking weakly against the floor as the roller spun. The sleeve of her jacket had disappeared completely into the gap, and the blood was already pooling beneath the frame. Supervisors shouted for the emergency shutoff. The alarm went off with a shrill metallic tone that echoed through the building. But the machine didn't stop right away. See, the rollers were massive and took several seconds to slow down, even after the power was cut. And during that time, the motion continued grinding forward, forcing her body deeper into the mechanism. When the rotation finally stopped, she wasn't moving. Her upper torso was pinned tightly between the rollers, with her face pressed against the steel. Her clothing had shredded and parts of her skin and hair were entangled in the gears. One of her shoes had come off and was lying several feet away, soaked in blood. Co-workers rushed toward her, trying to pull her free, but her body was wedged in place. The machine was slick with oil and blood, and the smell of hot metal and burnt fabric filled the air. Someone shouted her name, but there was no response. Her body at this point had gone limp. Emergency crews would arrive within minutes. When paramedics and firefighters reached, they could see that most of her upper body was crushed beyond any recognition. The rollers had completely flattened her chest and abdomen, splitting open her ribcage. Her arm was completely mangled, with her bones shattered and twisting around the rotating shaft. The pressure had forced blood and tissue into the gears, leaving dark streaks across the machine's surface. Firefighters used hydraulic spreaders and cutting tools to dismantle part of the rolling housing. The process was slow and tense. Every moment risked making the injuries worse or even damaging evidence for the investigation. So it took them nearly 30 minutes to finally free her completely. When paramedics finally pulled her out, she was pale, soaked in oil and blood, and also lifeless. Her torso had collapsed from the crushing force, and parts of her shoulder and back were torn open. Her face showed massive trauma, fractures from the skull and jaw from where she had been struck from the steel frame. The medical team checked for a pulse, but found nothing, so she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later documented the injuries as massive blunt force trauma and mechanical asphyxiation. The crushing pressure on her chest had destroyed her lungs and her heart almost instantly, and based off the extent of the injuries, she likely lost consciousness within seconds of being pulled in. Now, OSHA launched an immediate investigation. Inspectors arrived that afternoon, photographing the scene, reviewing maintenance logs, and interviewing witnesses. Their findings, like most cases, were straightforward. The accident was preventable. The machine had not been properly locked out before Trisha approached it, so it was still running, and there was no physical barrier or sensor to stop it when she leaned too close. OSHA cited 3M for multiple violations, including failure to follow lockout/tackle procedures and insufficient protection against contact with moving parts. The fines totaled tens of thousands of dollars. The company issued a statement expressing condolences and promised to reevaluate safety training across all facilities. But for the workers who were there that day, the aftermath was traumatic. Several had to be sent home after the cleanup began. Blood had splattered across the floor and nearby walls, and the roller assembly was so badly contaminated that it had to be partially replaced. Now, there's no record of a lawsuit filed by Trisha Jones' family against 3M. Under Wisconsin workers' compensation law, families cannot directly sue their employer after a workplace death unless they can prove intentional disregard for safety, which technically OSHA did not find her. To explain it a bit more, because there was no clear proof that 3M knew about the exact hazard and chose to ignore it, they couldn't sue. They saw it as a tragic procedural breakdown, preventable yes, but not deliberate. That means her family likely received workers' compensation death benefits, which typically include funeral costs and partial wage payments to dependents. 3M cooperated fully with investigators, accepted OSHA citations, and paid the administrative fines, which were estimated to be between $25,000 and $65,000, depending on the final classifications of the violations. No criminal charges were filed, and OSHA's report concluded the machine was functioning correctly. Unfortunately, like most cases, the lockout system was not being used when it should have been. Work inside an elevator shaft is some of the most dangerous work in construction. It involves confined spaces, open vertical drops, and heavy machinery. Every level of a building is connected by that single column of empty air. One misstep can mean falling hundreds of feet before hitting concrete. Now, at a Midtown Manhattan construction site in May 2015, everyone knew that danger. The future Ryu Plaza Times Square Hotel was still just a skeleton of steel and concrete. Workers moved through the building in hard hats, guiding beams into place and welding frames. The floors were unfinished and the edges were lined with temporary guardrails, and in the center, several open elevator shafts ran straight from the basement to the roof. Inside one of the shafts, crews were installing elevator systems that would eventually carry guests through the new high-rise. The shafts were narrow and dimly lit, with the walls being unfinished and coated in dust. Work lights hung low from cords, swinging slightly as the air moved through the building. The smell of concrete dust and welding smoke filled the space. Now, among that crew that day was Christian Ganisi. He worked for a subcontractor hired to install the elevators. His duties included helping fit door frames and guard rails, so the metal channels that keep the elevator cars moving straight up and down the shaft. The job required precision and physical effort. It also required trust. Workers inside the shaft relied on each other and on the machinery to keep them safe. Christian and another worker were using one of the construction elevators, a temporary car built for installation work. Now keep in mind, it wasn't finished. Just a platform with partial walls and a simple control panel. It was designed to move workers and tools between floors while the main systems were still being assembled. Now, around 12:40 p.m., the elevator they were in stopped unexpectedly between the 23rd and the 24th floors. It hadn't reached the landing. The car was about 5 feet below the 24th opening, hanging still. So the two men waited, expecting it to move again, but it didn't. The motor had stalled. Normally, when an elevator stops short, workers are supposed to stay inside until it can be reset or stabilized by maintenance personnel. But it was midday, the site was busy, and the gap didn't really look large. So they decided to get out on their own. The other worker went first. He climbed into the lip of the car, grabbed the floor edge above, and pulled himself up. The landing's edge was made of bare concrete and rebar, coated in construction dust. He managed to get both feet over and stood up on the floor safely. Because the other worker made it, Christian would follow. He stepped onto the edge of the elevator car, crouched slightly, and pushed off to grab the landing above. Now, this is where everything went wrong. His boot slipped on the metal surface as he jumped, because it was coated with dust and a thin film of oil from the machinery. This would lead to his hand missing the ledge by inches. Now, there was no time to recover. He lost balance and fell backward into the open elevator shaft. Workers above heard the sound immediately, and then a long, hollow noise, the scrape of his boot against the edge, a short yell, and then a long, hollow noise as his body fell through the open vertical tunnel. Now, that drop from that height was more than 200 feet. And to make this all even worse, inside the shaft were cross beams, support rails, and brackets for the elevator doors. So as he fell, his body struck the sides of the shaft multiple times, hitting the metal guardrails and protruding bolts, stripped away pieces of his clothing, and left blood along the concrete wall. The noise echoed upward, so sharp metal strikes followed by dull thuds as his body hit successive levels. The fall finally ended in the basement level, where the unfinished shaft met the concrete foundation of the building, and this impact was catastrophic. Workers on the lower floors felt the vibration through the floor. When they looked toward the shaft opening, they saw dust rising from below. And when that happened, someone shouted for everyone to stop working. All the power tools on that site went silent across the site. Crews on the ground level ran toward the basement. The shaft opening was surrounded by scaffolding and loose materials. And when they looked down, they saw him lying face up on the concrete, motionless. His helmet had shattered on impact. Pieces of it were scattered around him, along with fragments of broken light fixtures and steel brackets knocked loose during the fall. The damage to his body was obviously severe. The impact had crushed his skull and spine, and multiple bones were broken. His right leg was twisted unnaturally beneath him, and there were visible fractures along both arms. Blood had pooled beneath his torso and splattered along the nearby wall. The fall had torn his clothing apart, leaving deep abrasions where metal rails had sliced through fabric and skin on the way down. Workers stood at the edge of the opening, stunned. Someone climbed down partway on a ladder, calling his name, but he didn't move. They could also see that his chest wasn't rising. When this happened, calls went out to 911 in the building's front office. The sound of sirens reached the site minutes later. Firefighters and paramedics would arrive, carrying harnesses and stretchers. They secured the area and descended carefully into the shaft, aware that debris could still fall from above. The paramedics reached him first. His body was cold and still. They checked for a pulse and found none. His injuries seemed instant and fatal. Massive blunt force trauma to the head, neck, and torso. His ribs had collapsed inward from the impact, and internal bleeding was visible even through the torn fabric. Firefighters used ropes and a stretcher to lift his body back up to the shaft. It was a slow process, because they had to navigate around the same beams and brackets he had struck on the way down. Dust fell as they moved, coating their helmets and gloves. The shaft smelled of concrete, dust, and blood. When his body finally reached the basement level, they laid him on the floor and covered him with a white sheet. His boots were missing. One had actually came off during the fall and was found several floors above. The police arrived shortly after, setting up a perimeter and beginning photographs on the scene. They measured the distance between the elevator car and the landing above it. It was a 5-foot gap that it seemed small enough to step across. Investigators marked the shaft walls where blood and fabric had stuck to the concrete, showing the path of his fall. From the 24th floor to the basement, each mark traced another violent impact. By the time the recovery team carried his body out through the ground level entrance, the workday had effectively ended. The sun was starting to lower behind the nearby buildings, throwing long shadows across the site. It was found out he had fallen less than 3 seconds before hitting the ground, a drop long enough for a single scream and then silence. It was only a short distance to jump, just a few feet to the next floor, but with no guardrail, no tether, and no margin for error, it was enough. Christian was just 25 years old. He had been doing a routine task he had done dozens of times before, and one slip turned it into a fatal fall that no one could stop. In the days after the accident, OSHA and the New York City Department of Buildings opened a joint investigation. Inspectors documented that the elevator subcontractor, G Tech Associates, had been operating without a valid city license. They found that the guardrails were missing around the shaft's openings, and that no fall protection was in use. The Department of Buildings issued a stop work order and cited the contractor for a Class 1 aggravated safety violation, which is the most serious classification. OSHA investigators later determined that the accident was entirely preventable, the result of improper safety procedures and a lack of fall protection. The body was released to his family after the medical examiner's review. His funeral was held a few days later in New Jersey, near his hometown. Because of the nature of his injuries, the service was closed casket. Families, friends, and fellow veterans attended, along with several co-workers from the site. And because Christian was a U.S. Army veteran, the Army provided an honor guard at the burial. His mother received a folded flag at the end of the ceremony. Suzanne Hart, age 41, arrived for work at Young & Rubicam. It's an advertising agency located at 285 Madison Avenue in Manhattan, on the morning of December 14th, 2011. It was just before 10 a.m. and employees were coming in for the day. The building was an older midtown high-rise with multiple elevators servicing the upper floors. That morning, one of those elevators was undergoing routine maintenance. The doors were open and a mechanic from Transel Elevator Inc. TEI Group was in the elevator bank area performing electrical adjustments on the control system from a nearby service panel. The elevator car had been taken out of service, but the safety lock that should have kept it immobilized had not been properly engaged. Now, Suzanne entered the lobby as usual, holding a coffee cup and her phone. She worked as an account executive and took the elevator daily to reach her floor. Security footage showed her walking toward the bank of elevators, where 2 employees were waiting. One elevator stood open on the first floor, its doors wide and lights on the inside. To anyone passing by it, it appeared to be functioning normally, but what no one realized was that the elevator was not properly secured. See, the car was parked a few inches higher than the landing, and maintenance wires were still connected. The door interlock circuit had been temporarily bypassed for testing, leaving the control system live. Inside the bank, a mechanic was adjusting wiring on the electrical panel, not realizing that the energized circuit would allow the car to move. So, at 9:56 a.m., Suzanne stepped forward into the open elevator. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the car suddenly rose upward. See, the doors had not yet fully closed, but because the bypass left the circuit active, the elevator motor engaged the instant her weight triggered the floor sensor. After that, the elevator surged upward with her halfway inside, so in less than a second she was trapped at the chest level against the top of the doorway. The rising car pulled her upper body into the shaft while her legs and feet remained in the lobby. So her head and shoulders were forced into the shaft space, and the moving car trapped her between the floor of the elevator and the frame of the first floor entrance. The lower portion of her body was pinned outside, leaving her legs visible in the lobby. Witnesses nearby heard a sharp mechanical noise followed by screams. One of the 2 employees waiting behind her jumped back as the door slammed shut around Suzanne's midsection. Another worker pressed the emergency stop and ran for help. The noise echoed through the marble lobby, the grinding of a metal on metal followed by silence. Security staff immediately called 911. Firefighters and paramedics would arrive within minutes. They found Suzanne's body wedged in the doorway. The elevator stopped several feet above the lobby ceiling. Her injuries were instantly fatal. Massive crushing trauma to the chest, abdomen, and spine. Pressure had compressed her body against the frame, causing irreversible internal damage. Firefighters worked carefully to stabilize the car before attempting to free her. Before they could lower it though, every shaft in the bank had to be secured and power isolated to prevent secondary movement. That process alone took a whole hour. Using manual lowering gear, crews then brought the car down a few inches at a time until they could reach her safely. In total, it took almost 2 hours to recover her remains. When the car was lowered, it revealed that her upper body had been drawn entirely into the shaft, while her legs and feet were still outside, like I said. The New York City Department of Buildings DOB and OSHA opened an investigation. Inspectors determined that the maintenance crew had bypassed key safety mechanisms, including a jumper wire used to override the door interlock circuit. And this allowed the elevator to move even though the doors were open, something that should have been mechanically impossible. Transcell Elevator Inc. was cited for multiple violations. City records show that the mechanical performing maintenance that morning had temporarily overridden the door safety circuit to test the car's function. He was supposed to remove the jumper wire before returning power, but failed to do so. So when Suzanne stepped inside, the elevator system interpreted it as a normal call and engaged the motor. DOB investigators confirmed that the lift moved upward at full speed at the exact moment she entered. The automatic door system had been effectively tricked into thinking the doors were shut. There was no time for her or anyone nearby to react, as the entire event lasted less than even 2 seconds. The autopsy later confirmed the cause of death as crushing injuries to the torso, so death was instantaneous. City officials ordered all 13 elevators in the building shut down immediately for safety testing. Workers who had been in the lobby described the aftermath as eerily quiet, her coffee cup lying on the marble floor, and her cell phone vibrating nearby. OSHA's investigation concluded months later, citing Transcell Elevator Inc. for quote willful safety violations related to improper maintenance practices. The company was ultimately fined $14,000, the maximum penalty at the time, for a single willful violation, for failing to ensure that the elevator's interlock systems were properly disabled before restoring power. The New York City Department of Buildings also issued 23 separate violations to Transcell and the building's management, including, quote, failure to maintain elevator equipment, unsafe maintenance procedures, and inadequate supervision during testing. The city's final report stated that 3 mechanics had been working on the elevators that morning, and that 1 improperly left a jumper wire in place, directly leading to the fatal movement of the car. As a result, the DOB suspended Transcell's license for 30 days and required all mechanics involved to undergo retraining and recertification before returning to work. The building reopened its elevators only after full inspections and rewiring of all safety interlocks. Suzanne's funeral was held in New York City several days later. It was a private service attended by family, friends, and co-workers from Young and Rupa Kam. The casket was closed. Mourners described her as intelligent, warm, and deeply dedicated to her work. She was also known in the office for arriving early every morning, always with a coffee in hand, smiling and ready to start the day. An ottoman bed is a type of storage bed that allows the entire mattress base to lift up, giving access to a large compartment underneath. Instead of using drawers like a divan or captain's bed, the entire sleeping surface opens upward, revealing a hollow area that's useful for storing bedding, clothes, or other household items. They've actually been used for centuries. Now I'm guessing you can tell where and who invented them based off the name. The Ottomans. They invented it in the 18th century. The term Ottoman originally referred to low upholstered seats used throughout the Ottoman Empire. These early Ottomans were often long benches with internal storage compartments, serving as both seating and storage furniture. Eventually, European furniture makers borrowed the concept during the 18th and 19th centuries, creating what they called Ottoman furniture, multi-purpose pieces that opened or lifted to store household goods. The idea evolved as industrial manufacturing and household design advanced. By the mid-20th century, as urban homes became smaller and people sought ways to save space, furniture companies began producing lift-up storage beds. Early models used simple hinges or springs, but they were heavy, awkward to open, and dangerous if they fell shut. Now the modern ones are completely different. The way they work are actually pretty simple. Underneath the mattress frame are two thick metal rods, called gas lift pistons or gas struts. Each one is a sealed cylinder filled with compressed nitrogen gas, and inside the cylinder is a piston that slides up and down. When you lift the bed using the handle near the foot or side, that trapped gas expands and helps push the heavy mattress platform upward, almost like a spring but much smoother. It holds a huge amount of weight, sometimes even 100 pounds or even more. But because of the gas pressure, it feels light when you lift it. Now, once it's fully raised, the gas pressure inside the pistons holds the frame in place, letting you access the storage underneath without feeling any of the weight. To close it, you simply press down and the gas compresses again, controlling the descent so it lowers gently instead of slamming shut. Now that's the design, and for most people, it works fine. But the safety of an ottoman bed depends entirely on those pistons holding firm. Now, with that in mind, a woman named Helen Davy had one of these ottoman beds in her bedroom. She was a 39-year-old mother of 2. She had a daughter named Elizabeth who was 19 and a son named George who was 11, and they were from Seaham, County Durham, England. Now, Helen worked from home. She was a beautician. She ran a beauty and skincare business from her home. Now that likely means that she did things like facials, waxing, nails, or other cosmetic and skincare services for local clients. Now, on June 7th, 2024, Helen was in her semi-detached house. She woke up, made breakfast, and dropped off her son, George, at school. She then drove back to her home, and when she got there, her daughter had already left, as she had gone out that morning to get her hair done and do a few other things. So this left Helen alone at home. Now, fast forward a few hours later, Elizabeth returned home. She unlocked the door and came inside. She then yelled out to her mother that she was home, but weirdly there was no answer, so she walked out to her backyard, or garden, thinking she may be outside and that's why she can't hear her, but she didn't find her out there either. So she walked back inside and went up the stairs, as she now noticed her mother's bedroom door was open, which immediately stood out to her because it normally wasn't, as Helen always closed her door. When she looked inside the room, that's when she saw her mother lying on her back with her head under the ottoman bed. Her legs were bent as if she had been trying to get up. Elizabeth naturally dropped everything she was carrying and ran to lift the mattress frame. She managed to prop it up slightly with her foot while trying to reach her mother. She noticed Helen's face was blue and there was a clear indentation on her neck from the bed frame. Now, we will come back to this later. Sometime between late morning and early afternoon, Helen went upstairs to her bedroom after finishing a few light chores around the house. Because she worked from home, her bedroom wasn't just a place to sleep, it doubled as a storage space for her business. Now, under her bed, she kept spare linens, clean towels, and maybe boxes of beauty products or extra supplies she didn't use every day. And with the Ottoman-style bed, it made it very easy. All she had to do was lift the mattress platform to access the compartment underneath. It's likely she was doing something ordinary, perhaps stripping her bed to change the sheets, grabbing a fresh set of towels, or reorganizing the storage area to make room for new supplies. She would have had to lift the mattress using the small strap or handle attached to the base. The gas lift pistons beneath would have made it feel light, damn near effortless. Once it was raised, it would have stayed opened on its own, or at least that's what she expected. At some point though, one of those pistons gave out. The coroner's report later confirmed that one of the gas struts had failed, which meant the frame was only being supported by one side. That imbalance probably wasn't obvious right away. While the bed might have tilted slightly or even made a faint creak, that was not enough to warn her of the danger. So while she was still leaning in, probably reaching toward the far end of the compartment to grab something near the wall, which would have made her head and shoulders directly under the raised platform. When the defective piston lost all its pressure entirely, the other one couldn't handle the full weight of the mattress and frame, which led to the entire platform coming down in a sudden, uneven drop. Because she was bent forward with her upper body inside the storage space, the edge of the wooden frame likely struck the back of her neck or shoulders first, pinning her downward in an awkward position. The weight pressing down from above, combined with her neck wedged against the bedside's panel, stopped her from breathing. She probably tried to push herself out at first. Her knees or feet might have slipped on the carpet as she struggled to lift the frame or twist out from under it, but once the full weight settled, it would have been impossible to move. The fall itself might have been almost silent, so no loud crash or break, just the dull thud of the mattress settling back onto its frame. If so, there would have been no noise for neighbors or passerbyers to notice. And because she lived with just her 2 children, neither of whom were at home that time, there was no one to hear her or help her. Now back to Elizabeth. When Elizabeth found her mother trapped under the bed, she immediately tried to lift the mattress platform herself. But it was obviously too heavy, so she braced it with her foot. When she realized her mother wasn't breathing and saw the color of her face, she called emergency services, 999 in the UK, and then started CPR. The Northeast Ambulance Service would have been the one to respond, as that's a local service covering Seaham. For a Category 1 call, which is what this would have been, a person unresponsive and not breathing, response times are typically within 7 minutes on average, sometimes even faster in residential areas. Depending on whether she was connected directly to a paramedic crew or dispatcher-assisted CPR line, she likely stayed on the phone while performing chest compressions. When paramedics finally arrived, they found Helen trapped in the same position, already unresponsive and without a pulse. At that point, they would have checked for vital signs, confirmed cardiac arrest, and attempted advanced life support. In cases of mechanical or positional asphyxiation, if the person has been without oxygen for several minutes, recovery is extremely unlikely. And in Helen's case, she already had been trapped for some time before being found, so the paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene. The official cause of death was positional asphyxiation. When officers arrived at the home, they likely interviewed her daughter, who explained how she had found her mother trapped under the bed and had called her for help. The officers would have documented the scene, taken photographs of the bed, and noted the condition of the mechanism, since it was clearly a mechanical failure. Because there was no signs of struggle or forced injury, and because the evidence pointed to a domestic accident, the case was quickly classified as non-suspicion. What makes this all even worse was her father, Stephen Davey, gave an interview to The Sun that he had also lost a son, Helen's brother, just a few years earlier in another freak accident, which made the tragedy even harder for the family. Rejuvenance is located at 1501 South Las Vegas Boulevard in Las Vegas, Nevada. It sat in a small commercial plaza near the downtown area, a typical Las Vegas strip-side business. Glass doors, a bright signage, and a minimalistic interior meant to look like modern and clinical. The place is a cryotherapy spa, which is a wellness or recovery center that offers cold-based treatments for beauty, pain relief, or athletic recovery. In these spas, the therapy involves exposing the body to extremely cold temperatures for a very short time, usually between 2 to 3 minutes. Now, there are 2 main types of cryotherapy used in these spas. The first is the whole body cryotherapy, which is where a person stands inside a sealed upright chamber that surrounds the body from the neck down. The chamber is cooled using liquid nitrogen vapor, dropping the internal temperature to between -160 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 to 3 minutes. Only the person's head remains outside the chamber, so they can breathe room air while the rest of the body is exposed to extreme cold. It was originally developed in Japan in the late 1970s as a therapy for arthritis, but it later became popular in Europe and the United States among athletes and wellness clients. Spas and recovery centers advertise it for reducing muscle soreness and inflammation, speeding up recovery after workouts or injury, boosting metabolism and burning calories, tightening the skin, or improving mood through endorphin release. However, scientific research has not proven most of these claims. The US Food and Drug Administration has publicly stated that there's no evidence WBC can effectively treat pain, injury, weight loss, or skin conditions. Now, the second one is localized cryotherapy, which is the targeted form of cryotherapy. Instead of exposing your whole body to freezing air, it focuses the cold on a specific area such as joint pain, injured muscle, or swollen spots. Here's exactly how it works, and how it differs from the whole body cryotherapy. Localized cryotherapy uses a handheld device that blows a stream of supercooled air or nitrogen vapor onto the small area of the body. The air is usually between a -160 Fahrenheit and -200 Fahrenheit, but only hits the skin for a few seconds to a couple of minutes. It's similar in concept to icing an injury, but much colder and faster. Now, for this specific case, we will be focusing on the first type of cryotherapy. so the whole body cryotherapy. Now, the procedure for the whole body one is the client wears minimal clothing, usually underwear, gloves, socks, and slippers to protect extremities. They step into the cryotherapy chamber and the operator closes the door. Liquid nitrogen is released into the chamber, cooling the air instantly. The person remains inside for up to 3 minutes while their skin temperature drops rapidly, sometimes from 90 degrees to 32 degrees in seconds. After the timer ends, the operator opens the door and the person steps out. During this process, the operator is supposed to stay present the entire time, because the nitrogen vapor can rise and replace oxygen around the user's face. Now, if oxygen levels fall below about 10 to 12%, a person can lose consciousness within seconds, even if they don't feel short of breath at first. Now, at this cryotherapy spa was a 24-year-old employee named Chelsea Patricia. She was actually the night manager there. Now, on October 19th, 2015, she arrived at work in the late afternoon or early evening, as she normally did for the evening shift. Now, her job is quite straightforward. Throughout the day, she handled clients seeking whole-body cryotherapy sessions. Her duties included greeting customers, preparing the nitrogen-cooled chamber, adjusting settings, timing sessions, and cleaning the area afterward. She was trained in the daily operation of the machine, but not in advanced cryogenic safety, because the business had no formal safety program or licensing. Now, the business hours for this spa were 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. Since she was a night manager, she would stay after 8 p.m., so after closing. Now, after the last customer left, Chelsea began her normal end-of-shift routine, so cleaning the treatment rooms, sanitizing equipment, and securing the nitrogen tanks for the night. Just normal stuff. But just before closing completely, she decided to take a cryotherapy session herself. Now, this was something staff sometimes did after hours for muscle relaxation or recovery, and there was no company rule forbidding it, and because she was a clothing manager, she had the keys and full access. Now, this is important. At this point, Chelsea was the only person in the building, so no one else was there. She entered the whole body cryotherapy chamber to begin her session alone. Now, the treatment room itself was small, enclosed, and properly ventilated, roughly the size of a large closet with no exterior windows and a single door leading back into the hallway. The nitrogen tank sat only a few feet from the chamber, connected by insulated hoses. When she started the machine, liquid nitrogen from the pressurized tank was released into the chamber, where it instantly expanded into a colorless gas, hundreds of times its original volume. The vapor poured upward and swirling like white clouds, cooling the air rapidly but also pushing oxygen out of the space. Now, nitrogen is odorless and invisible once mixed with air, giving no warning to the user. Because nitrogen is heavier than oxygen, it accumulated near the floor first and began replacing breathable air from the bottom up. Within seconds, the oxygen concentration in the chamber dropped well below the 19.5% threshold required for normal respiration. As it continued to build, the surrounding room air also became oxygen poor. In those conditions, a person can lose consciousness in less than 10 seconds, with no sensation of suffocation, just dizziness and disorientation. Chelsea likely began what she thought was a normal 2 or 3 minute recovery session, but as the vapor thickened, she would have felt the rapid cooling and possibly lightheadedness, not realizing that she was inhaling almost pure nitrogen. Her oxygen-starved brain shut down almost immediately, and she collapsed inside the chamber. When she lost consciousness, she was unable to stand upright, and her head likely dipped below the rim into the heavier gas layer, accelerating the lack of oxygen. And with no attendant present, the chamber's nitrogen valve remained opened until the timer expired or the tank emptied. The system continued releasing freezing vapor for several minutes, filling both the chamber and the room around it. As the liquid nitrogen expanded into gas, it displaced virtually all breathable air. The ambient temperature inside the chamber stayed around -200 Fahrenheit, and the room itself dropped well below freezing. Over the next few hours, the nitrogen slowly vented out through minor air gaps, leaving the room silent, cold, and oxygen depleted until the spa reopened the following morning. The next morning at around 7 a.m., one of Chelsea's co-workers arrived to open Rejuvenant for the day's appointments. When the employee arrived, they immediately noticed something off. Chelsea's car was still parked outside in the same spot from the night before. The front door was locked from the inside, which was unusual for an opening shift because the closing manager, Chelsea, should have unlocked it before leaving. The co-worker unlocked the door and entered. The spa was quiet and dim. Chelsea's personal belongings, her purse, keys, and phone, were still on the front counter, and the facility looked like it hadn't been cleaned up from the previous night. At first, the employee assumed she might still be working there late, for whatever reason, so they called out her name several times. When there was no answer, they began checking each room. Upon entering the small cryotherapy treatment room, the employee saw the cryotherapy chamber lid still raised, slightly, and a dense layer of frost along the rim and hoses. The room felt unusually cold, and when they looked inside the chamber, they saw Chelsea's body slumped and motionless, with her skin pale and covered with frost. The nitrogen tanks nearby were empty or near empty, indicating the system had run for a long period of time. After that, the employee immediately backed out of the room and called 911. Within minutes, units from the Las Vegas Fire and Rescue and Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department arrived at the spa. Firefighters were the first to enter, wearing protective breathing gear because of the risk of residual nitrogen gas inside the treatment room. When they stepped inside, the air was uncomfortably cold and heavy, and frost covered the hoses, walls, and part of the chamber. Using portable oxygen detectors, they found that the oxygen concentration in the room was still below safe levels, confirming nitrogen displacement. They opened the front and back doors and used large fans to ventilate the entire facility before proceeding further in. Once oxygen levels normalized, paramedics confirmed that Chelsea was deceased. Her body was found inside the cryotherapy chamber, partially upright but leaning against the interior wall, frozen in place. The temperature inside the chamber was still well below zero, and the floor and sides of the machine were coated with a thin layer of frost. Firefighters and paramedics documented the scene. They checked the nitrogen tanks and turned off the main valves to prevent further vapor release. They then notified the Clark County Coroner's Office, which sent investigators to the scene. Detectives from the LVMPD Homicide Division and a deputy coroner arrived shortly after. They photographed the chamber, nitrogen tanks, and control systems. Detectives noted that the spa's safety equipment was inadequate, so no ventilation fans, no oxygen sensors, and no emergency shutoff accessible from inside the room. The coroner's team carefully removed Chelsea's body after the chamber and room had warmed enough to do so. They transported her to the Clark County Medical Examiner's office, where a full autopsy was scheduled for later that day. The autopsy confirmed she had died from asphyxiation caused by nitrogen displacement, losing consciousness within seconds of exposure. Now, there was no evidence of foul play, drugs, or alcohol, and the injuries on her body were limited to superficial cold burns and frostbite caused after death. Although, like I said before, other employees at Rejuvenance had occasionally taken cryotherapy sessions by themselves, but Chelsea's situation was far more dangerous. On the night she died, she was completely alone in the building, and she used the chamber in a small enclosed treatment room with no ventilation or oxygen monitor. During normal hours, when staff used the machines alone, someone else was usually nearby or the door was left open, allowing oxygen to circulate. But Chelsea's session created a sealed environment where nitrogen gas could rapidly build up, displacing all breathable air. With no one present to supervise, no airflow to restore oxygen, and no automatic shutoff system to stop the gas flow, her solo session turned fatal within minutes. A perfect storm of conditions that no one else at the spa had ever faced before. Now, once the Clark County Coroner's Office ruled Chelsea's death accidental, that the criminal portion of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's investigation was formally closed. However, state safety regulators and health officials continued examining the case for several months. The Nevada Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, opened an independent inquiry into Rejuvenant's cryotherapy spa. Their investigation focused on whether the company had provided a safe work environment and whether the equipment met state or federal standards for cryogenical systems. Inspectors documented several major failures: no formal safety training, no written protocols, no oxygen or monitoring ventilation, no medical license, and no unsupervised use allowed. In early 2016, OSHA issued formal citations for serious safety violations under Nevada labor law. The company was fined, although the amount was not publicly disclosed, but it was part of the small business penalties, generally in the thousands, not tens of thousands of dollars. The citations emphasized that asphyxiation from nitrogen gas is a known industrial hazard, and that the spa had failed to protect its employees from that risk. After the investigation ended, Chelsea's family brought her remains to Hawaii, where she was buried. Following the services, they did not pursue a public lawsuit, but they did speak to the news outlets, urging stricter oversight and warning others to not use cryotherapy machines unsupervised. Rejuvenance never reopened. The company's name was removed from business listings the following year, and the building was later repurposed. of March 3rd, 2017, identical twin sisters Jean Haley and Martha Williams left their home in Barrington, Rhode Island with plans for nothing more than a quiet evening out with family. The two women were 97 years old, only 2 months shy of their 98th birthday, and despite their age, they were known for being active, independent, and close with their siblings. But what they didn't know was that the few simple steps from their car to their front door would turn into a situation neither of them could escape from. To understand everything that happened, you have to begin earlier on that evening. Jean and Martha had gone out to dinner with their younger sister, who was 89 at the time. The three of them had a habit of meeting up, eating together, and spending time just as they had done throughout their lives. Now, there was nothing unusual about this specific night. They didn't drink and they weren't out too late. This was just a normal family outing. After dinner, the three sisters returned to Jean's home on Opeechee Drive in Barrington. The time was somewhere between 8 and 8:30 p.m., confirmed later by investigators. Now, Jean was the one who drove the car that night. Even at 97, she was still licensed, still capable, and still comfortable behind the wheel. Martha, on the other hand, relied on a walker for support. The two had always balanced each other out. Jean was more mobile, while Martha was more careful, but both were still mentally sharp and physically capable, at least for their ages. When they pulled into the driveway, the younger sister, who had followed them home in her own vehicle, said goodbye and left, as she had no reason to worry or stay longer as the twins lived together, supported each other, and handled their nightly routine without issue. As far as anyone knew, the night was perfectly normal, but what no one saw was the exact conditions outside. According to the National Weather Service, temperatures in Barrington had already started dropping from the low 20s into the teens by the time the sisters had gotten home, and the wind was blowing at 10 to 15 miles per hour, which accelerates heat loss dramatically. Over the previous days, a mix of melting snow and light freezing rain had left many residential driveways in the area coated in thin, transparent ice, kinda like the type that reflects no light and blends completely into pavement. And in neighborhoods like theirs, where homes are spaced apart and street lighting doesn't directly hit private driveways, these patches become extremely difficult to detect even for much younger adults, let alone someone of their age. I want you to keep that in mind, by the way. But after the younger sister drove away, Jean and Martha began making their way from the driveway toward the house. Martha moved slowly with her walker, focusing on steady steps across the pavement, while Jean walked a bit behind her. The cold was already severe, and as I stated before, weather records showed that temperatures would continue dropping throughout the night, eventually reaching 11 degrees by early morning. Now, the turning point came only seconds after they stepped away from the car. At some point during their walk toward the front door, Martha slipped. Investigators later concluded she likely stepped on a patch of black ice, lost her footing, and fell backward. Because the ice offered no traction, her walker remained standing upright beside her, something police noted later because it indicated she didn't get knocked over or lose her balance in any uncontrolled way. She simply just slipped backward and landed on the driveway. Now, given her age and her reliance on the walker, getting back up on her own would have been nearly impossible. Jean saw her sister fall and did what anyone would do. She moved quickly toward her to help, but the pavement, as I said, was covered in the same invisible ice, so as she approached Martha, she would also slip. Her fall carried her toward the garage area of the home, where she landed close to the garage door, and just like Martha, she was unable to stand back up. And this is where the horrific part of the story begins. The part most people don't think about when they hear hypothermia. When someone lies on frozen pavement, the ground pulls body heat away up to 25 times faster than cold air. So the moment their clothing made contact with the ice, heat began draining out of their bodies at a rate their age simply couldn't withstand. So within minutes, their skin would have started to burn with cold, like deep aches that cut into the bones and make every attempt to move feel heavy and slow. As their core temperatures slipped below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, their muscles would have started to fail. Hypothermia isn't just cold, it shuts down the body from the inside. Their hands would have stiffened to the point where fingers barely responded. Their legs, already weakened from the fall, would have refused to cooperate. Every attempt to push up from the ice would have felt like trying to lift their own body weight through wet cement. Now, as hypothermia deepens, shivering becomes more violent, then stops completely. Not because the person is warm, but because the body no longer has enough energy to shake. Confusion sets in, thinking clearly becomes almost impossible. People start making slow, uncoordinated movements, sometimes barely lifting their arms or trying to crawl inches at a time. That confusion would have hit them slowly and silently as the night went on. Even their ability to yell for help would have collapsed. In freezing air, the vocal cords thicken and stiffen. Breathing turns shallow, and speech becomes quiet without the person even realizing it. Now add in the residential layout, spaced out homes, windows shut tight against the freezing temperatures, and cul-de-sacs with almost no nighttime traffic, and the odds of anyone hearing them become nearly zero. The wind only makes everything even worse. Gusts blowing across the driveway would have stripped more heat from their exposed skin. Frostbite doesn't take long at those temperatures, and the first signs, numbness and waxy skin, would have crept in silently. Their cheeks, hands, and ears would have gotten numb first, followed by a spreading cold that felt like it was sinking deeper into their bodies. Now, the detail I'm about to share with you is actually incredibly sad. Investigators later mentioned that Jean's body position suggested she tried to move toward the garage door, so she was close enough to reach safety, just a few more inches of movement. But like I said before, the ice offered no traction. Her clothing was frozen against the pavement, her muscles weakened, her coordination gone, and her ability to pull herself forward slipped away as her body temperature dropped. Martha's situation was just as grim. The walker still upright beside her meant she likely tried to grab it to pull herself up, but with no grip strength, stiff fingers, and no friction on the ice, she had no leverage. So every attempt she made only drained more of the little energy her body still had. As the hours passed, the scene around them turned even harsher. Frost formed across the driveway, their clothes stiffened even more, and their breathing slowed more and more. Eventually, as their core temperatures fell toward the low 80s, unconsciousness became inevitable. Now this is the final stage, the quiet stage, where victims stop moving, stop shivering, and simply slip deeper into the cold until the heart can't keep pumping. By the time dawn approached, the twins had been lying outside for nearly 12 hours. At around 8 a.m. on March 4th, a neighbor leaving for the day looked over and noticed two shapes lying motionless in the driveway. Getting closer and realizing what they were looking at, that neighbor immediately called 911. When first responders arrived, they found Jean near the garage door and Martha near her walker. EMS confirmed there was no signs of trauma beyond the fall and the effects of the cold exposure. The Rhode Island medical examiner determined the cause of death was severe hypothermia. Police found no signs of foul play, no forced entry, and no suspicious activity. Only the frozen driveway that had turned two simple steps into a fatal situation. Jean and Martha lived 97 years side by side. They were born together, they stayed together, and by tragic circumstances, died together. Their final night wasn't reckless or dramatic. It was a silent, unforgiving freeze on black ice. The kind of accident that happens in seconds but becomes impossible to escape even when safety is only a few feet away. Christine Marie Rollins, at 59 years old, worked as a private caretaker for an elderly woman in Chambers County, Texas. Her days began early, often long before sunrise, because a woman she cared for needed help getting ready each morning. She lived in Liberty County, about half an hour away from the home where she worked. Now, that part of Texas is filled with long stretches of rural land, two-lane roads, open fields, and scattered houses separated by wide spaces, and the property where she worked was no different. It sat off Cove Road near Anahook, with a main house, a separate small building on the property, a long driveway, and plenty of natural landscapes surrounding it. Now, people familiar with that area know that it's normal to see wildlife passing through open yards or moving near tree lines. It isn't city living, it's quiet, spacious, and rural. Christine had been employed by the family for close to a year. She helped the elderly woman with morning tasks, like preparing food, helping her get dressed, checking medication, and making sure the home was set up for the day. These were the things she had done in caregiving roles for years, and she was trusted to handle them without supervision. Her employers described her as reliable, her friends described her as dependable, and people close to her said she rarely missed work unless something unavoidable came up. And even then, she communicated clearly. Now, on the evening of November 23rd, 2019, nothing about her behavior stood out. She spent time with her friends earlier in the evening, spoke with her boyfriend later on, and went about her night as she normally would before an early shift. so she didn't mention feeling sick, she didn't report anything unusual, and her conversations were the same as every night before work. The next morning, she woke up at her usual time. It was still dark outside. She gathered the items she normally took with her and then walked outside to her car. She then started to drive from Liberty County to Chambers County. Now at that hour meant traveling roads with almost no traffic, so she would get there fast. Christine reached the property shortly before 6 a.m., which matched her usual arrival time. She stepped out, grabbed her things, and began walking toward the house. The path from her car to the front door was short and simple. She did it every shift. The porch light offered a faint glow around the entrance, but the yard itself remained dark. This you need to keep in mind. Now, inside the home, the elderly woman Christine cared for was still asleep. She expected Christine to come in soon, just like every other morning. The woman couldn't move around easily, so Christine's arrival was an important part of her daily stability. Usually Christine would enter quietly, but she always came in around the same time. But on this morning, that familiar routine did not happen. After enough time passed without hearing Christine come inside, the elderly woman began to feel uneasy. She couldn't just go outside and check, but she knew something wasn't right. Her husband lived in the small building across the driveway. I don't know why, but according to what I found, he just did. And sometime around 6:45, he stepped outside to walk over to the main house. Now this was a normal part of his routine, but as he approached the house, he noticed something on the ground near the entryway. At first, he couldn't tell what it was, but when he walked closer, he realized it was Christine. She was lying on the ground only a few steps from the front door. Seeing this, he immediately called 911. Deputies with the Chambers County Sheriff's Office and emergency medical personnel arrived quickly. Christine was unresponsive, and paramedics confirmed she had died before they reached her. Because the circumstances weren't immediately clear, deputies examined the area closely. The injuries present on her body were not typical of a fall or medical collapse. They documented the scene carefully, photographed the area, and treated it as a case requiring forensic review. Her body was taken to the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences, where full examination was done. Medical examiners looked at the wounds, the distribution of injuries, and the condition of the surrounding environment. They compared her injuries to known patterns of trauma and ruled out possibilities one by one. There was no signs of assault by another person, there was no indication of medical collapse causing the injuries, there was no vehicle strikes or evidence of any sharp weapons, at least from humans. Now, what the examination did show was absolutely brutal. Christine had sustained multiple puncture wounds, deep tearing injuries, and extensive trauma consistent with being attacked by a group of feral hogs. The wounds were not clear or uniform, they were ragged, uneven, and spread across her body, which is what happens when several hogs rush, ram, bite, and hook a victim simultaneously. Now, feral hogs don't attack like dogs or cats. They use their speed, weight, and tusks as weapons. A mature hog can weigh 200 to 300 pounds and can run up to 30 miles per hour, which is faster than even Usain Bolt. When they charge, they slam into a person's legs to knock them down, then attack the torso, arms, and face. Their lower tusks are sharp, curved upward, and designed to tear, not puncture cleanly. The medical examiner confirmed that Christine's injuries included tusk/lacerations, multiple penetrating wounds from repeated charges, severe tearing damage to soft tissue, and extensive bleeding from numerous blood vessels opened during the attack. She died from exsanguination, meaning she bled out from the sheer number of openings in her body. And because it was still dark outside, she would have had almost no warning until the hogs were already on her. Once that conclusion was reached, investigators returned to the property to examine the ground more closely. They documented multiple sets of hog tracks around the area where Christine's body had been found. The ground showed signs of disturbance consistent with a rapid animal movement. The soil was soft from recent rain, making tracks and drag marks more visible. Now, just like the last story, Christine had almost made it inside. The attack happened just a few feet from the front door, but like I said, just like the last story, unfortunately she didn't make it inside. She just wasn't fast enough. Based on the evidence, investigators concluded that Christine had stepped out of her vehicle and was walking toward the house when she encountered the hogs. In poor lighting with dark terrain and low visibility, she likely did not see them until they were already close. The attack would have been fast, chaotic, and overwhelming, and with the homeowners inside asleep, the struggle went unheard. Now, the deputies tried to find the hogs, but they could not identify or isolate the specific hogs involved. as feral hogs travel in groups, roam large territories, and don't stay put after an attack. Her death was ruled a feral hog attack, one of the rarest but most violent wildlife-related fatalities in the United States. Stephen Dyerke showed up for his shift on June 2nd, 2022 at the Caterpillar Foundry in Mapleton, Illinois, and nothing about that morning stood out as unusual, because this was a place where people dealt with heat, noise, and heavy steel every single day, and the routines were set in stone that workers often joked the building itself could run the first few hours of the shift without anyone in it. This was a massive facility where iron was melted down and poured into molds to create parts for the enormous machines Caterpillar builds. And everything in that environment ran off a rhythm which came from years of doing the same process over and over again. The part of the plant Stephen worked in was the melting and casting area, which is already one of the most dangerous areas in any foundry, because you're dealing with iron heated to temperatures that most people would back away from, even if they were 5 or 6 feet away from it. You've got these giant furnaces, recessed pits, elevated walkways, steel platforms, and open areas where molten metal sits glowing orange for hours. Now, Stephen wasn't an old employee who had been there for decades. According to OSHA documents and local reporting, he had only been at the foundry for about a week. And at a facility with this level of danger, 1 week is barely enough time to learn where everything is, let alone how everything works. Normally, new hires get a walkthrough, hands-on safety examples, and shadowing from experienced workers. But several employees later told investigators that the place was understaffed, and the training wasn't always as thorough as it needed to be, especially for a job involving molten metal. A few workers even went as far as to say they felt new employees were rushed into areas that weren't ready for because production deadlines were tight and the company wanted people on the floor as fast as possible. Now, the shift had been moving normally that morning, with people checking equipment, prepping material, and dealing with the usual heat that comes from having massive furnaces running non-stop. It was so damn hot, even areas far from the melt floor were hot, and the protective gear workers wore wasn't optional. It was the only thing between them and temperatures that could cause burns without even touching anything. The layout of the building involved platforms built around pits, stairways, graded metal flooring, and railings that were supposed to keep people away from the most dangerous edges. But this would not happen. Now, according to OSHA and the timeline investigators reconstructed, Stephen was assigned to work near one of the large crucibles, which are these huge containers that hold molten iron. These crucibles sit inside sunken pits with platforms wrapping around them so workers can check temperatures and monitor the melt. Now, it was discovered that some of these platforms didn't have proper guardrails or mid-rails even in spots where they were required, and OSHA later confirmed this was true. In fact, there had been concerns raised before Stephen was ever even hired, but they hadn't been corrected. Now, sometime in the late morning, surveillance footage and witness statements showed Stephen working near one of those elevated platforms. He had tools with him for checking the material and moving through the normal prep process. Now, investigators couldn't map out every single second because factories like this have constant movement, noise, and visual obstructions, but they narrowed down that Stephen took a step toward a section of the platform that didn't have the barrier it was supposed to have. Workers nearby said they heard a quick metallic sound, like something shifting under weight, and when they turned, they saw Stephen slip forward. Like I said, there was no railing and no mid-railing, so there was nothing to stop him, and before anyone could reach him, he fell straight into the crucible. The temperature of the molten iron was over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt through steel, and the exposure was so severe that several workers backed away from the radiant heat alone. People who ran toward the platform said the air itself felt like it was hitting them in waves, and they couldn't get within arm's reach because even the briefest contact with that temperature would cause catastrophic injury. The fall happened so fast there was nothing anyone could physically do. After this, supervisors immediately called emergency services, and Caterpillar locked down that area while they waited for the Tazewell County Sheriff's Office and first responders to arrive. When deputies and the coroner got there, they had to wait for the temperature to drop enough to safely approach, and the shutdown process wasn't quick, because you don't just shut off molten iron. Foundry workers had to assist law enforcement and the coroner because the environment was just too dangerous for responders to step in alone. By the time the area cooled, the coroner, Charles Hanley, confirmed that Stephen's death was caused by exposure involving molten metal and traumatic injuries consistent with the conditions in that area. There was no foul play suspected, and the incident was ruled a workplace accident. After this, OSHA began its investigation right away, demanding training records, logs, safety documents, maps of the production floor, and interviews from everyone who had been working there that day. Over the next several months, OSHA uncovered a list of safety failures that had been there long before Stephen even arrived. They determined Caterpillar had failed to protect workers from fall hazards in an area where molten metal was present. The section of platform Stephen had been standing on did not have the required guardrail, and multiple workers confirmed this wasn't new. OSHA also found that employees were not properly trained to recognize hazards in these areas, especially new hires who had only been there for a few days. Because of these violations, OSHA issued over $145,000 in fines, including one labeled as willful, which is the kind of citation OSHA uses when an employer knew about a hazard and didn't fix it. After the investigation ended, Caterpillar updated training guidelines, added new guardrails and barriers, and revised parts of the platform layout. OSHA ordered several safeguards to be installed around the melt line area, and they followed up to confirm Caterpillar made the required changes, which they did. This is Stephen Gress and his girlfriend Michelle Brandis, and they are absolutely disgusting, which you will soon find out. On February 6th through the 8th, 2025, a 16-year-old girl named Miranda Corsett had been on a dating site. From what I could find, the site was called Grindr. It's, as I said, a dating site. Although under the terms of services to be on it, you have to be 18 or older. But to get by this, Miranda created a fake profile that listed her as 18, even though she was only 16, which allowed her to appear on adult user feeds. A few days later, around February 10th through the 11th, she started to message a 35-year-old man named Stephen Gress. Now, the exact full messages have not been fully released to the public, only small fragments of the early conversation have been released. The early messages were described as friendly and flirtatious. What's interesting to note is Miranda, after some time talking with him, told him her true age, 16 years old, and yet Stephen kept on talking to her. He even went as far to say she was mature for her age, and then he even invited her to hang out, even though he knew she was underage. After that, she replied with she was down to chill. They then set up a time and date for the hangout, which was the 14th, a few days later. After that, Stephen then sent Miranda his address, and Miranda must have sent him her address as well. And then they continued chatting for another day or so, finalizing when she'd come over. 3 days later, on the 14th, Miranda had gotten home from school and told her parents she was going to hang out with some friends, which her parents said okay since they thought she was going to hang out with friends from school. But that would not be the case, as when Miranda left, she got into the car of Stephen Gress. They then drove to his house in St. Petersburg, which is about 8 to 9 minutes from her house, which was in Gulfport. By the way, this is in Florida. He and she then walked into the house, and this would be the last time anyone saw her, so she would never leave that house, at least alive. From February 15th through the 23rd, her parents would text her and call her. Sometimes the messages showed up as delivered, but she didn't reply. They thought she might be staying with a friend or upset and wanting space. When she didn't reply after the few days of calling and texting, the mother started to call the parents of the kids Miranda usually hangs out with. But the parents said they haven't seen her there, and that's when on February 24th, the mother finally realized that something was wrong, so she filed a missing person report. She would tell the police everything she could, that Miranda had said she was going to hang out with friends on the 14th, but she never came home. The police then asked her, well, why didn't you call sooner? Her response was she had been texting and calling for several days, but the messages kept showing up as delivered, which made her think Miranda was ignoring her rather than missing, as technically she had done this in the past. But it was only after the phone stopped responding completely and none of her friends had actually seen her did she realize something was wrong. The responding officer noted the delay in the initial report, a 10-day gap, but recorded there was no signs of parental neglect or intent to withhold any information. The case was immediately classified as a missing/endangered juvenile, and detectives were assigned that same evening. The only real clue they had was her phone, so detectives subpoenaed Miranda's phone records and social media data. They found out that the last signal from Miranda's phone was in the 34th Street South area of St. Petersburg. They also pulled her Google account location history and found that her phone had traveled a route consistent with someone being driven from Gulfport to St. Petersburg on February 14th, then never leaving that area again, which further supported her being in the St. Petersburg area. Along with Snapchat, Instagram, and the dating app, detectives also sent emergency preservation orders to Google, Apple's iCloud, and the phone carrier. This ensured no data could be deleted while warrants were pending. The dating app's compliance team responded first, sending a metadata packet that contained the account creation timestamp, which was early February 2025, the registered username and email address, which investigators later confirmed were linked to Miranda's real Gmail account. It also contained message logs and IP addresses showing every session she had while talking to the user Stephen G. Now, those IP addresses trace back to a residential Spectrum internet account registered to Stephen Gress, who lived, like I said before, in St. Petersburg, Florida. The app also included a short content preview of the first few messages. Detectives compared the timestamp of the last message with Miranda's Google Maps location history. It matched perfectly with the moment her phone began traveling towards St. Petersburg on February 14th. That discovery gave detectives enough probable cause to request a warrant for the residence connected to that IP address. Once the warrant was signed on February 26th, a search team was assembled. But before they went to the house, investigators canvassed the surrounding blocks, speaking with nearby residents and pulling surveillance footage from local businesses. By cross-referencing those videos with phone tower data, they traced vehicle movements consistent with Gress's car on February 14th and the following morning. These combined results provided the foundation for the next stage of the case. They allowed detectives to reconstruct the timeline of events and confirm that Miranda's phone activity and Gress's location data overlapped precisely within that small area of St. Petersburg. After gaining all the evidence they needed, the police showed up to Stephen's house. They surrounded the property just before dawn, setting up a perimeter so no one could leave. Detectives approached the front door, knocked loudly, and announced that they had a search warrant. Inside was Stephen Gress and his girlfriend Michelle Brandes. Both were escorted outside while the officers secured every room. When detectives entered the house, they began their search with body cameras recording and crime scene technicians documenting every inch of the property. What they saw inside immediately stood out. The home appeared recently clean, but certain areas still showed signs that something serious had happened. Technicians noted streaks and faint stains that reacted under forensic light. Those samples were collected, swabbed, and sealed for testing. On the counters and in the garage, officers found bottles of bleach, heavy-duty trash bags, and rolls of plastic wrap stacked near a mop that still smelled of disinfectant. Several towels and rags were partially wet, and investigators marked and packaged each one. A phone case fragment and a small piece of jewelry, later matched to Miranda through family identification, were found in a waste bin behind the kitchen, which 100% confirmed Miranda had been there. In the living room, detectives gathered the household computers, a pair of cell phones, and the Wi-Fi router, all of which were later shown to have connected to the same IP address used in the online messages. Everything was logged, photographed, and sent for forensic analysis. When the lab results came back, several of the stains tested positive for blood, and DNA confirmed that it belonged to Miranda. That single result changed the nature of the case. What began as a missing person search was now a homicide investigation, but they didn't find any body at the house. So detectives traced Gress's movements through cell tower pings and surveillance footage. His phone and car were tracked to a commercial dumpster site in Hillsborough County. So detectives traced Gress's movements through the cell tower pings and the cameras, and it led them to a commercial dumpster site in Hillsborough County. Police believed that's where he dumped Miranda. The dumpster he had used had already been emptied earlier that morning, meaning the entire load was taken straight to the county incinerator, which means everything inside was burned. Although investigators searched the facility and found debris and items linked to Miranda, but not an intact body, and authorities said it's extremely likely her remains were destroyed in the burn. This meant her family may never be able to recover her for a proper burial. But that discovery confirmed the worst and tied everything back to the evidence they found inside Grace's home. But Steven and his girlfriend didn't just kill her, no, they tortured her. Police believe between February 20th through the 24th, she was repeatedly beaten and assaulted until Michelle took a ball from a pool table in the backyard, put it in a sock, and shoved it down Miranda's throat, and then wrapped her face with plastic wrap. What makes this even worse is what Steven said to the police. He stated that he told Michelle not to cover the nose, but Michelle did it anyway, and he couldn't get to Miranda quick enough to poke holes in the plastic before she died, meaning he planned on torturing her even more. For the reason Steven and his girlfriend did that was because apparently she stole a ring, which is absolutely fucking crazy to do all that to someone because they stole a ring. And that's not even true according to a friend of the couple. He also took photos of her nude and injured. He sent them to 3 confirmed people, which one was disgustingly to his mother. Detectives approached her when she went to Steven's home to pick up his parrot after his arrest, and the warrant details their brief conversation. The mother told detectives she was aware that her son had a history of killing animals, and that she had received some text messages and photographs of Miranda, but denied ever looking at them. She claimed she told her son to let the girl go, but never contacted police for whatever reason. That's all I could find on their conversation, by the way. After killing her, Steven allegedly said that they then put the body in the trunk of the car and went to play mini golf and get Popeyes to celebrate Michelle's birthday. They then dismembered the body in the yard of a family member's home. Both Steven and Michelle were arrested and taken into custody without incident. They were then booked into the local county jail on multiple felony charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, and evidence tampering. Within days, detectives handed the case to the state attorney's office, which formally upgraded the charges after reviewing the autopsy and digital evidence. Prosecutors described the case as one of the most disturbing acts of cruelty they had ever seen. By mid-March, a grand jury indictment the state's intent to pursue capital murder charges against both defendants. At their first court appearance, they were ordered held without bond. The courtroom was filled with reporters and members of the public who had followed every update. In the months that followed, investigators continued gathering digital evidence, text logs, photos, and metadata, expected to be central to the upcoming trial. Prosecutors also began looking into possible accessory charges against the people who allegedly knew Miranda was being held but never contacted police. But at this specific time, no one has been charged. As of now, both Michelle and Steven remain in custody awaiting trial. Prosecutors have made it they intend to seek the maximum penalty allowed under Florida law, which is the death penalty. Now, I personally see it happening given the evidence against them. The police got a phone call from a woman named Heather Jones. She said that her husband, Michael Jones, had physically assaulted her and claimed she feared for her own safety. So the dispatcher sent a couple of police cars to her house in Kansas City. When the police got there, they banged on the door, and the wife, Heather Jones, opened it and let the police inside. But when they stepped inside, they noticed that the place was absolutely filthy. There was garbage all over the floor with a bunch of rotted food, with dirty piles of clothes scattered everywhere. There was what looked like animal feces on the floor with urine stains as well, and the smell was noted to be horrible and disgusting. Also, what was weird was there was cameras literally everywhere, which struck the officers as odd. What they also noticed was kids. There was 5 of them, and they all looked terrified and very malnourished. It was like they were scared to make any noises, which is weird because in most domestic violence calls, kids cry, cling to the safer parent, or talk a lot out of fear, but they weren't, which off-put the officers, but they performed their duties as normal, separating the two and taking their statements. Heather said Michael had assaulted her and she was scared of him, and that things had been bad for a while. After that, the officers then went to speak with Michael, but he wouldn't answer any simple questions. He kept dodging eye contact, changing his story multiple times, and according to the officers, acted irritated. While that was happening, a few of the other officers checked on the children to make sure they were safe and if any of them witnessed the fight. But still, they didn't speak and were really terrified. They actually kept looking at Michael. Another thing that came into account is when the police had asked them how many kids lived with the house, Heather said 6 and Michael said 5, which was a big red flag. The officer said, "Okay, give me the names of every child who lives here." They said them all, but they said the name Adrian, but they couldn't point out which one he was. Then they took the children out of the room and away from the parents, and asked who and where Adrian was. They finally started to speak, but very weakly, but they said they haven't seen him in a while. They also learned that his extended family had said they haven't seen Adrian in a while as well. So now at this point, there were so many red flags that the police eventually arrested both Heather and Michael for neglect, as the kids were malnourished, had untreated injuries, and Adrian was nowhere to be found. When they questioned Heather at the station, she broke down saying that Michael killed Adrian and said she had no part in it. She tried to get him to stop, but he would beat her. When investigators asked where the body was, she told that Michael took his body out back near the pig pen, as they had one in their backyard. So investigators stepped out the room, regrouped with the officers on scene, and told them they needed to secure the entire backyard immediately, including the barn area and the livestock pen. When detectives walked toward the back of the property, the first thing that hit them was the smell. A mix of mud, waste, and decay. And even though farms can smell bad on a normal day, this was different. It was heavier and sharper. They walked past old fencing, broken tools, and piles of debris. Then they eventually reached the pig pen. It looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in a long time, with dirt, mud, and waste all mixed together. The pigs were pacing around, and the ground near the edges looked like it had been disturbed recently, uneven, churned up, as if someone had been digging or burying something. One detective stepped closer and something pale caught his eye near the edge of the pen. At first, he thought it was just a piece of plastic or a stick, but when he bent down and brushed away some dirt, he immediately froze. It wasn't plastic, it wasn't wood, it was bone. A small fabric, but unmistakably human. He stood up slowly and told the others to stop moving, and then he radioed out that he had found potential human remains. Within minutes, the entire scene was taped off. The house was officially declared a crime scene, and more units and forensic teams were requested. As more soil was removed and the area was examined, investigators found additional bone fragments spread around the edge of the pen and mixed in the dirt. The condition of the remains made it clear that Adrian did not just die. His body had been disposed in one of the most horrific ways imaginable, and with that confirmation, everything Heather had told them instantly became horrifyingly real. Back at the station, detectives confronted Michael, who at first denied everything, then changed his story, then refused to speak. He shifted from irritated to hostile, claiming the police didn't know anything, but every answer he gave only made him look worse. Heather, meanwhile, kept crying and repeating that she tried to stop him, that she was scared, and that Michael was the one who did everything. She insisted she had no part in Adrian's death, that she was abused too, and also a victim, and that she only stayed silent because she thought Michael would kill her next. Whether any of that was true didn't matter in the moment. What mattered was that a 7-year-old child had been killed and discarded in a pig pen, or at least what they thought. Once both adults were booked, detectives and forensic teams began going through the house inch by inch. They checked the bathrooms, the basement, the kitchen, the bedrooms, and eventually found the surveillance setup Heather and Michael had used to monitor Adrian. Oh, and I don't even think you can even consider the bedrooms as bedrooms. They looked more like prison rooms, and filthy ones at that. But on the SD card, they found videos that were so bad and horrific. Now this is important to keep in mind. Adrian didn't always live with them. He initially lived with his birth mother, but he was eventually taken away from her because of her own struggles that the state said made her unable to safely parent at the time. So he went to live with his father, Michael. Now they found videos of Adrian locked in a small shower stall for long periods of time, barely able to move and sitting in filthy cold water. Each video from the time he got there showed him getting thinner and thinner. It got so bad that his ribs were visible. Some of the other videos showed him being beaten and him collapsing to the floor afterward, crawling back to the shower stall, and this was over months of time. What they found in the shower stall was so bad that investigators said it didn't even look like a shower stall anymore, more like a torture chamber. There were chains drilled into the wall, zip ties, belts, a little pallet for vomit, drink dirty water from the shower floor, and go without food for days at a time. The other kids later told investigators that they could hear him cry softly so he wouldn't get in trouble. They heard thuds and hitting. They heard Michael yelling at him daily, and they were so terrified to say anything. I mean, it got so bad that he couldn't even stand. He couldn't crawl normally. He would constantly collapse. He had tremors and his legs were too weak to support him. Michael even had to drag him out of the bathroom by the arms and legs. Now, it was also found out that it wasn't just Michael doing this. No, it was also Heather, because when investigators searched their phones and their messages to each other, it was confirmed that Heather was in on it. Heather would send messages to Michael saying, quote, "He is literally fading. He's so weak. Don't feed him. Make him do it again." She also sent photos to him of his injuries and photos of him being restrained. Now, from what I could find, they couldn't pinpoint what he actually died from. They just know it wasn't fast. They think because he died slowly as months of starvation, dehydration, cold exposure, and physical abuse destroyed his body little by little, until he couldn't stand, couldn't crawl, and finally couldn't move at all. When that happened, Michael brought him back out to the pig pen and let the pigs eat him. They know the pigs ate his body as the bones recovered showed signs of animal activity. Now, if this hasn't pissed you off yet, this will. Multiple people, family members, teachers, state workers, and even Heather and Michael themselves contacted child abuse hotlines in state agencies. His teachers talked about his bruises. His grandmother, biological mother, and other family members repeatedly contacted multiple agencies as well. And they had been warned about Adrian long before he died, reporting bruises, injuries, strange excuses, and the fact that nobody had seen Adrian in months, and that Heather and Michael were hiding him. Every one of those warnings were filed and then ignored. Heather and Michael themselves called child services at one point, lying and claiming that a relative was abusing Adrian, trying to get ahead of any investigation and create a fake paper trail to cover themselves. Now, what makes this even more unbelievable, social workers actually visited the home at least twice before Adrian died, but they failed to protect him. They never interviewed the children privately. They accepted the parents' excuses without verifying anything. They didn't check the downstairs bathroom where Adrian was being kept, and didn't push further even when a worker noted he looked thin and small for his age. Instead of escalating the case, they just closed it. Even Michael's probation officer had filed concerns earlier, reporting domestic violence, an unsafe home, and possible child abuse, and still nothing happened. After this, both Heather and Michael Jones were eventually charged, and the evidence was so overwhelming that they pled guilty rather than faced a trial. They were both sentenced to life in prison. Now, because of how bad the system had treated Adrian, his biological mother, his grandmother, and his older sister filed a major lawsuit in 2017 after learning how badly the system had failed him. They sued the state of Kansas, the Kansas Department for Children and Families, and several individual social workers who had handled Adrian's case. The lawsuit argued that Kansas repeatedly ignored warning signs, including bruises documented by schools, hotline calls from family, early welfare checks showing injuries, and the fact that nobody had seen Adrian in months. Yet the state still closed case after case and never once confirmed he was actually safe. The family claimed these workers had a legal duty to protect Adrian and remove him from the home, and their failure directly led to his death. After years of court battles, Kansas eventually agreed to a $1 million settlement, essentially acknowledging that the state had ignored obvious signs of abuse and allowed Adrian to remain in the home where he was tortured and killed. When people think about hazards on a hiking trail, they picture things like loose rocks, dehydration, cliffs, heat exposure, or maybe taking a wrong turn and getting stuck outside longer than you meant to. And to be fair, they are common issues people deal with in desert areas. But on the simpler trails, take example of the ones near Usery Mountain Regional Park, people don't really think about any of that. Because these trails are, while they are dry, they're also very busy, well marked, and familiar to a lot of locals. So most people head out there expecting a simple walk, some quiet scenery, and a morning that feels predictable. And that was a mindset of 23-year-old Alex Bessler when he stepped onto the Merkle Memorial Trail during the morning hours of May 26, 2016. The Merkle Trail is a short loop inside Usery Mountain Regional Park near the Goldfield Mountains on the east side of the Phoenix metro area, which is mostly used by casual hikers because the path is wide and smooth, and not particularly steep. Another reason why many people choose it is because it's so simple and predictable. Now, that morning, Alex was hiking with a friend who had walked the trail before and understood the general layout, which meant there was nothing unusual or risky about the plan. Now, obviously when you're walking on a trail, you have to be wary of wild animals, especially in Arizona where they have all sorts, from coyotes to mountain lions. But what they also have, and what most people think they won't encounter, are bees. Now, contrary to popular belief, bee activity is actually very common, especially wild Africanized honeybees. They've actually been widespread across this region for decades, and although they look the same as regular honeybees, their behavior is different. To sum it up, they're basically menaces to society. But there's a reason for this. Back in Africa, there's a lot more predators to them, like the honey badger. The weather there is also more hostile, and the environment is just overall harsher for them, so they evolved to be a lot more aggressive. So in turn, they'll defend their hives way more aggressively and respond to disturbances much faster than regular honeybees. They are so aggressive, they will still react if a person never sees the hive, never touches it, or never even knows they were close to it. So hiking around them sometimes means you're completely unaware you are near a hazard until something happens. Now, as Alex and his friend moved along the trail, his friend walked slightly ahead, far enough to be separated but close enough that they were still sharing the same stretch of path. But remember, everything appeared normal. There was no warnings from other hikers about any animals. There were no posted alerts about animals in that specific area, so there was nothing that a reasonable person could interpret as a threat. But at some point on that trail, a large swarm of bees suddenly descended on Alex. Reports from the local county sheriff's office state the attack came without provocation or warning, meaning there was no clear triggers such as stepping on a hive or disturbing a nest. Now, these swarms can form incredibly fast, and once Africanized bees commit to attacking, they do it as a coordinated mass. Alex's friend, who was ahead of him, saw the swarm appear and reacted by taking cover off the trail, managing to shield himself long enough for the bees to lose interest. But Alex was surrounded before he ever had that chance. Multiple witnesses and responders describe the scene as something you would never forget. When Africanized bees swarm, they don't just sting once and fly off. They latch onto any exposed skin, crawl into hair, ears, and the corners of the eyes, under clothing, and they hit over and over. People on the trail reported seeing Alex on the ground completely engulfed, almost buried under a moving blanket of bees. His face, arms, and neck were so covered that you couldn't clearly see his skin underneath. The bees formed layers over him, so when some flew off, more were underneath still stinging. See, swarm attacks by Africanized bees follow a pattern where hundreds or even thousands of stings occur in a short period. And once the bees commit to an attack, they will keep stinging until something interrupts them physically. In Alex's case, by the time anyone could even get close enough to try helping, his body had already absorbed hundreds of injections of venom. So stingers were embedded everywhere. Responders later reported they were pulling stingers out of his skin in massive clusters because the bees had left them stuck in him in huge numbers. The swollen areas were already noticeable. His face was puffed, the skin around his neck thickened, and his eyes were reportedly nearly swollen shut when help finally reached him. Emergency response crews were notified quickly, but when they arrived, they couldn't immediately reach him because the bees were still actively attacking anything that came near. Firefighters and park rangers had to wait for the swarm to thin enough so they could move safely in. This delay wasn't because responders hesitated, it was because entering a dense active swarm risks additional victims and makes rescue impossible. Even protective gear is not fully reliable when a large, aggressive swarm is actively defending its space. When they finally reached Alex, they physically dragged him out because the bees were still clinging to his clothing and hair. As they moved him, bees were still stuck to his face and arms, and responders had to brush and scrape them off as they carried him. From the reports I could find, it was stated that he had been stung more than 1,000 times. People who saw him said his skin looked peppered with punctures, hundreds of tiny swollen marks overlapping each other, with stingers still sticking out like splinters. In swarm fatalities, the venom load becomes massive very fast, and in Alex's case, the amount of venom circulating through his system was overwhelming before he even made it out of the park. Alex was taken to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead soon after arrival. The volume of stings appears to have been the primary cause of death. With bee swarm fatalities, you usually see two possible mechanisms. The first is a severe allergic reaction, but in those cases, even a few stings can be life-threatening, and victims usually collapse quickly. The second mechanism, which was widely assumed in Alex's case based on the reported numbers of stings, is what's called toxic inflammation, where the sheer amount of venom overwhelms the body. It damages organs, causes widespread swelling, and triggers shock. When someone absorbs that many stings, the venom saturates the bloodstream, hits the kidneys, causes massive inflammation, and makes it extremely difficult to breathe because the throat and airway begin to swell internally. You don't need to be allergic for that to happen. The venom load alone can be fatal when stings reach the hundreds or thousands, which is what happened to Alex. Now, park officials closed the Merkle Trail immediately after the attack, so they can inspect the area for hives or other hazards. They eventually found a hive nearby, but reports did not specify how close it was to the exact spot where the attack happened. But bees can defend their territory aggressively within a wide radius, sometimes a few dozen yards or more, and hikers may never even see the hive itself, especially if it's inside a rocky crevice, buried in bushes, or wedged into the base of a tree. Investigators did not report any wrongdoing or external cause. It was simply a natural hazard that escalated beyond anything a person could realistically react to. The Salton River in Snohomish County, Washington is a fast, moving mountain river that comes straight out of the Cascade Range. There's one thing you notice immediately if you ever touch the water, is how freezing it stays even in late spring, because it's fed by snowmelt coming down into Spotted Lake, and by controlled releases from Coalback Dam, which means the temperature barely rises above ice cold. The river itself runs through a long forested canyon, and it drops steadily as it moves south, creating long stretches where the current keeps moving with force whether you're prepared for it or not. It also doesn't stay the same from 1 mile to the next either. Some parts widen out into a calmer flow, and then out of nowhere the channel tightens and starts folding over rocks, forming wave trains, hydraulics, and deep pockets that can pull things under. Now, different sections of the river are rated by difficulty. Padders treat each part like its own personality. There are areas where families drift through in simple inflatable kayaks, and then there are these harder stretches, where the water slams into constrictions and rises into standing waves tall enough to flip a raft if you come at them the wrong way. And when the dam upstream releases water, all those hazards get amplified. The flow rate jumps, the features grow, and even parts of the river that look mild on a normal day can turn aggressive. On these release days, the Salton River can hit around 1,400 cubic feet per second, which is strong enough to turn certain rapids into Class 3 and Class 5 sections. One of those is a rapid not far from the bottom that paddlers call Last Nasty, a place where the water funnels between rocks, shoots upward, and then collapses into a violent churn that flips rafts in seconds if you don't line up perfectly. The riverbed under that rapid is uneven. It's a mix of smooth stone slabs and deep hidden pockets that catch rope, clothing, tree branches, and really anything that sinks into them. When a rope or a strap gets pulled underwater there, the river pins it down like a clamp. The banks around this area are steep too, so if you fall in, you don't always get a clean exit point. Now, on April 25th, 2015, 4 people launched a raft onto that stretch of the Salton River. The water release from Coalback Dam had already raised the flow into that 1,400 range. Now, they pushed off from the area below the dam, expecting a normal afternoon ride downstream. One of the 4 rafters was 38-year-old Travis Lee Albin from Salton. Now, this is important to note. The group wasn't outfitted with specialized whitewater gear, so they didn't have helmets, they were wearing cotton clothing, and their PFDs weren't properly fitted for this part of the river, which is a serious problem because cotton holds cold water against your body, and an ill-fitted PFD can slip off the second you get pulled sideways. They moved downstream through the early sections without issue, until they reached the narrowing area near the bottom where Last Nasty sits. At this flow, that rapid becomes a sudden hit of force. The river folds over itself and punches upward, and when the raft entered it, the boat flipped. Flips like this happen quickly. One moment the raft is climbing a wave, and the next it's upside down, with all 4 people scattered in the current. They were thrown into the freezing water and had to fight their way to shore. Fortunately, all 4 eventually dragged themselves out onto separate banks, soaking wet, breathing hard, with the cold already setting into their arms and legs. The raft, however, didn't wash downstream. Instead, it stayed stuck midstream, rocking violently in place. A stern line, a rope attached to the back of the raft, had been pulled straight down into one of those deep pockets on the riverbed and pinned there by the current. Now, once a raft pins like that, the river turns it into a trap. All the force of the water slams into the underside and pushes everything against it. From the shore, the group could clearly see the raft wasn't going anywhere, as the stern line was stretched tight underwater. In the cockpit area of the raft, the inside section beneath the floor had rope threaded through it in a web pattern. When the raft flips upside down, those ropes hang down into the water like loose nets, and when the current hits them, they tighten instantly. At some point, while they were regrouping on shore, Travis went back into the river. From what I could find on news outlets, they said he entered the water to reach the raft, possibly to try and free the rope holding it or to retrieve the raft itself. Now, that wouldn't have been a big problem if his PFD was secured correctly when he went in, but it wasn't. Now, if you're wondering why that matters, it's because the moment cold water and strong current hit you, anything loose gets ripped upward. So the second he re-entered the river, that freezing water hit him with the cold shock response. Your chest expands sharply, and if your mouth is below the surface during that gasp, you pull in water right away. The chest muscles tighten instantly, your breathing rhythm breaks, and you lose a huge part of your strength in seconds. The current shoved him directly toward the pinned raft. When you're being carried into a stationary object underwater, it feels like you're being pushed against a wall. There's no room to lift your head because the water rushes upward into the underside of the raft. Now, under that raft, the cockpit ropes were hanging down in loops, twisting and tightening with every surge of current. So as soon as Travis was dragged into that pocket beneath the raft, those ropes would have started catching on whatever they touched. So his arms, his clothing, or the loose straps on his PFD. And once those ropes tightened, they locked him in place. The river forces your body sideways and presses you up against the underside of the raft. As I said before, you can't lift your head for air, because the water is flowing directly into your face. Every time the cold forces another reflexive gasp, water enters your nose and mouth. And some of it went down his windpipe, filling his lungs. Some of it was swallowed, filling the stomach, and at the same time, the pressure from the ropes and the raft makes it impossible for the chest to expand fully, so you can't cough anything out. And to make everything worse, the PFD, already loose, would have been pushed upward by the current until it rolled up around his face. Once the straps slip enough, the entire vest gets torn off by the river. That's why the PFD floated free before his body did. The shirt he was wearing tore off too. That does not happen gently. The rope scraping his arms and torso would have left deep abrasions. As they tightened under the current, they acted like moving saws, cutting and pinning at the same time. His legs and shoulders would have been pinned so firmly that he couldn't twist or push himself loose. As more water filled his airway, his oxygen levels would have crashed fast. Hypoxia sets in within seconds when the lungs are full. Vision tunnels, sounds fade out, and the brain starts shutting down. Combine that with the freezing water, consciousness slips away even faster. He would have lost awareness under the raft, still trapped in those ropes where the current kept pounding him into the underside. In some point after he was unconscious, the river finally tore him loose. That's the only way his body drifted downstream. Without the PFD, without the shirt, and with the current pulling at him from every direction, his body would have spinned, rolled, bounced off rocks, and drifted until it reached a point where the flow weakened enough for him to come to rest. He was found downstream on a rock bar wearing only his pants and shoes. The state he was found in matched exactly what happens when someone drowns under a pinned raft and is then freed by river force. Missing flotation gear, missing upper clothing, waterlogged lungs, signs of entanglement, and abrasions caused by both ropes and movement downstream. Rescuers cut the pinned ropes, freed the raft, located the survivors, and eventually recovered Travis's body. But by that point, the timeline made the outcome unavoidable. The accident was later confirmed by the sheriff's office and detailed in whitewater rescue reports. The flip, the pinned raft, the rope entanglement, the cold shock, and the improperly secured PFD all stacked together in a way that offered no escape once he was pulled beneath that raft. The people on your screen right now might be the worst people I've ever seen, and I'm saying that because the level of torment they brought onto a child who wasn't even 8 years old yet goes so far past anything normal people can process. And once you understand what they did, day after day, you start to realize that there's no excuse, no justification, just months of cruelty that built up until his body couldn't take any more. The child's name was Nathan Jones. He was born in Illinois, Peoria on December 7th, 2013, to Stephanie Jones and Brandon Walker. Now, Nathan's start to life wasn't the best, as when he was born his toxicology screen tested positive for narcotics, meaning Stephanie was using drugs while being pregnant. When that was found out, DCFS, the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, took custody of Nathan and his older brother. Now, DCFS had already been involved with his family for a long time. His mother had lost a child back in 2007, and according to the coroner, it was to SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome. Now, I want you to remember that because it's very important later on in this case. Now, Nathan and his older brother were put in DCFS care for a bit. Then they were given over to their paternal grandmother, Laura Walker. So for the 8 years that would follow, Nathan and his brother would live happily and quite peaceful with their grandmother. Though I do want to point out, the two boys did get to see their parents here and there. Although that would stop in 2017, when Stephanie spanked Nathan so hard, quote, it left extensive bruising. After that, from what I could find, his parents were either not allowed to see the kids, or they just didn't go visit them anymore, as I couldn't find anything on them visiting after that. But Nathan and his older brother, like I said, were very happy living with their grandmother. It was stated that Nathan was a joyful kid, and he loved to play with his older brother, and he absolutely loved to play with his dog. He was also very loved and cared for by his grandmother. Although he was a little difficult at times, but that's pretty normal for someone his age. Now, in 2021, the grandmother, Laura, had to go to Florida over a family emergency. It was actually her own parents who lived in Florida and needed medical care. So, not having anyone to babysit the kids, she would reluctantly turn to Stephanie and Brandon to take care of them for a bit, until she returned from Florida. They weren't the first people that came to mind, but the people that did, it couldn't. So she really didn't have anyone else, as it would be a few weeks until she would return. But the parents would agree and they took in the kids. For the next 6 weeks, Laura helped her parents down in Florida. She would then return back to Illinois and to the house of Stephanie and Brandon for the kids. But when she knocked on the door, no one answered, even though clearly they were there as their car was parked in front of their house. But they weren't coming to the door. They were flat out ignoring her. So she went around to look into the windows of the house, as maybe they might not have heard her knocking. When she peeked inside of them, she was absolutely disgusted at what she was seeing. This place was absolutely filthy. I mean, there was rotten food left on the kitchen counter and on the floor. There was what looked like dirty clothes everywhere. The place was overall just nasty and not a place for children to be living. Now, I'm guessing the grandmother didn't go into the house when she first dropped them off, or the house must have been cleaned before she dropped them off, as I highly doubt she would have consciously dropped them off there if she knew how bad the house was inside. Because the grandma does genuinely seem like a good person. And there's evidence to this, as even though they ignored her that day, she kept trying to get in contact with the parents for several days, even going to the house multiple days after and damn near banging on the door. But her being old, she couldn't really do nothing, especially when the idiots at DCFS wouldn't help her. Laura called them multiple times, but they literally did nothing. She even called the Peoria Police Department, showed them her papers that claimed her as the sole legal guardian, and told them about the condition of the house. And yet, they did fuck all. I mean, that's the best way I could explain it. They literally did nothing. The grandma stood outside for hours for the police to literally do nothing. She would then return back to Washington, Illinois, back to her house. But she was not done there. She then called the Washington Police Department saying the same thing she told the Peoria Police Department. And yet again, they basically did nothing. They just went and knocked on the door like the Peoria Police Department and the DCF agents. Basically, they did nothing and accomplished literally nothing. Although the police would call Brandon, and he actually picked up this time, saying he would return them that same evening, but he didn't. So they called him again. Brandon picked up and said he was in the Chicago area with the boys and Stephanie, and that they will be back in 2 days, and then they will return the boys. But yet again, when the 2 days went by, they didn't return the kids. Then Laura filed the kids as missing. So then, once again, the police called Brandon. But Brandon said something different this time. He said no effing way that Laura was gonna get back the kids, as he claimed that she abused and mistreated them. And he also said he was in a different state. I bet you can guess what the police did. Nothing. So for the next 7 weeks, DCFS would try to get in contact with him. And finally, Brandon picked up the phone. He, the boys, and Stephanie are in Florida and are not planning on returning back to the house. Although Brandon said Navin had a doctor's appointment the following week, and he said he would allow them to see Navin. He then would tell them the doctor's office and when the appointment would be. But as you could probably guess by now, when DCFS got in contact with the doctor's office, they found out they had nothing scheduled. After that, for whatever reason, the Illinois DCFS contacted the Florida DCFS to see if the family had anything reported on them with abuse. Now I said for whatever reason because it's not like the parents are gonna report themselves as abusers. So it was kinda dumb for them to do that. With literally all the evidence going against the parents, them being past abusers, their houses being so dirty, and them literally not allowing DCFS to see the children, they closed the damn case. And that's even despite the grandmother having legal claim over the kids. After this, 3 months would go by with nothing on the family, until February 14th, 2021, when an anonymous tip came to the DCFS saying that the family was back in Illinois and abusing Navin. They would then get into contact again with Brandon, but he rebuked all the claims, and had agreed for an investigator to come to the house to see if the claims were true. But like with all the times before, nobody answered the door. They then called him again and said he forgot about it, and then he rescheduled. Now the claims were that Navin had a black eye, and this investigator wanted to see if this was true. Keep that in mind. So he rescheduled it to happen a week later, and lo and behold, Navin didn't have a black eye. Although if he did have a black eye, it would have been healed by then. So this was just counterintuitive. So the investigator reported that he had no marks or bruises. Although he did report that Navin looked very thin and skinny for his age. Now he was wearing a baggy hoodie and sweatpants, so they couldn't see his whole body. But it's crystal clear in this picture that they aren't feeding him. But when the investigator asked why he looked like that, Brandon's response was that Navin was eating plenty, but he just wasn't gaining any weight. Which is absolutely BS, as you can tell from the picture. Now, if this hasn't absolutely pissed you off yet, I know 100%ly this will. When the investigator said that he may have a medical disorder, Brandon would reply with, well, he couldn't take him to the doctor's office as he didn't have legal custody. So the investigator would respond with, he would help them to get temporary custody. Now I want you to remember that this investigator and the DCFS knew of Brandon's and Stephanie's backgrounds. Just keep that in mind. So over the next few days, they would work with Laura, Stephanie, and Brandon for temporary custody. Now this took a while to do, and in the process, Laura would get rightfully pissed. I mean, how the hell is DCFS considering and doing this with Stephanie's and Brandon's track record? Laura was scared for Navin's health and thought, well, since DCFS wasn't going to help her and the parents clearly weren't going to give the kids back, then she would just sign over custody to them so the kids could go see the doctors. But before they could get the paperwork signed, 911 got a call. It was from Stephanie, saying that she found her son Navin unresponsive.
What's he doing today, ma'am?
Getting late, so I'm sorry.
What's happened today?
I went upstairs because I hadn't heard from him and found him unresponsive on the floor.
Is he breathing?
No.
Okay. I am sending the paramedic.
CPR before I called you guys, and I can't get anything.
Okay. Is there a defibrillator available? If so, send someone to get it now and tell me when you have it.
She said she put him to bed the night before. The next day, she was eating lunch and realized that she hadn't seen him all day, so she went to check on him and found him unresponsive. She then brought him to the shower to spray him with cold water, but he just wouldn't wake up. When paramedics came to the house, they did find Navin unconscious in the bathroom, and he was cold to the touch and not breathing. From what the paramedics could see, Navin was extremely malnourished. I don't know how, but he was even thinner now than he was in that picture. He also had tons of bruises and cuts on him. They tried CPR, but unfortunately he didn't come back to life. He was then transported to the hospital, but still no luck. Now back at the house, investigators said the home was in decent condition and looked fairly normal, except for Navin's room. When they opened the door, they didn't walk into a regular kid's bedroom. They walked into something that was more like a cell. There was almost nothing in there for comfort, barely any furniture, and the floor and parts of the room were soiled with feces. The smell of urine and waste was strong enough that one officer later said the pictures didn't even capture how bad it was. Instead of a normal doorknob, there was a rope system used to secure the door from the outside. So if they decided to shut him in there, he had no way of getting out. They also found a closet with a padlock on it. And when they went inside, they found bloodstains everywhere and fecal matter everywhere as well. Also, they found a note on the door that read as followed: "Don't give Navin any food or drink. Do not let him out the room. He has what he needs until I wake up." Now before this, I'd like to note that Stephanie and Brandon were told that Navin didn't make it, and their reactions were, well, I'll let you be the judge of that.
Ma'am, I'm sorry to have to tell you, but through all our efforts, there's nothing that we can do further.
Oh my God.
Do you guys have time?
Just call him.
The cop just told me.
What the do you mean?
They cannot resuscitate him. That's what the I mean.
There's no way! There's no way!
I've been telling you and the DCFS bitch that he needed to be seen.
You guys are putting all your business out in front of everybody.
That his behavior was not normal.
Stephanie, with a cigarette in her hand, was crying into her hands, or at least making the sounds of crying. And Brandon ran to his car and slammed his hands on the hood, saying there was just no way. The investigators could tell that Navin was being heavily mistreated and clearly abused based off his room. He was not allowed much food and no items of any comfort. But it wasn't until they examined his body they found out how bad he was being abused. When they undressed him at the hospital, they saw bruises basically everywhere. On his arms, his legs, his back, his stomach. Even on places that shouldn't be bruised unless someone is deliberately hurting you. And these weren't fresh injuries either. A lot of them were different colors, which means they had happened on different days. Over and over. They also found cuts and abrasions on him, little marks that matched being hit with objects or being dragged across rough surfaces. His knees were scraped down like he had been forced to kneel or crawl around on the dirty floor and that room for long periods of time. Then there were the ligature marks on his wrists. And those were one of the worst things because doctors said they didn't look like one-time bindings. They looked like something that had been tied around his wrists repeatedly, tight enough to leave deep grooves and indents in his skin. When you combine that with the rope on the outside of the door and the locked closet with blood and feces, you start to understand that this wasn't just ignoring a child or forgetting to feed him. This was months of intentional cruelty meant to control him, punish him, and isolate him completely. When the medical examiner finally performed the autopsy, everything just got even more disturbing, because Navin only weighed right around 30 pounds, which is closer to the weight of a toddler rather than a growing 8-year-old. The doctor said his body showed signs of severe chronic malnutrition, which means he wasn't just missing meals here and there, he was being starved slowly over time, to the point where his body started consuming itself. They also noted he had barely any muscle left and no fat reserves, and his bones were sticking out so sharply that they were visible underneath his skin even without pressing. The examiner said you don't get like that unless you're being deprived of food for a very, very long period of time. His internal organs also showed signs of starvation. His electrolytes levels were dangerously low, and he had internal injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, meaning at some point he had been hit hard enough to cause internal bleeding. And all of this was happening while he was locked in a filthy room with feces and urine on the floor. While the autopsy was being processed and detectives were trying to piece together exactly how long this had been going on, they also seized Stephanie's and Brandon's phones. And this is where things somehow got even worse, because the messages they found made it clear this wasn't neglect from two clueless parents. This wasn't someone being overwhelmed or not knowing what to do. These were messages that showed intention, cruelty, and a level of coldness that you just don't expect from the people who are supposed to protect their child. Detectives found texts where they talked about Navin being sick or not eating, and instead of taking him to the doctor or trying to fix anything, they used those things like excuses or punishments, almost like they were blaming him for starving when they were literally the ones refusing to feed him. There were messages where they mentioned him crying or being hungry, and instead of saying they'd given him food, they talked about keeping him in that room, about not letting him out. And even though the exact wording of every text wasn't released to the public, it was made clear that these conversations matched the handwritten note found on the door. So this wasn't accidental. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something they had talked about and agreed on and carried out day after day. At this point, the police would arrest both of them. It was found out later in an interview that it was Stephanie that wrote the message on the door to Brandon, by the way. And that was after she took a plea deal, because Brandon was saying he wasn't guilty, even though clearly he was. After that, the police would go over all the past reports their grandmother made, and it went back years. But eventually they were both convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Now, this is not the end. We gotta go all the way back to the start of this case, when I said Stephanie had lost a child back in 2007, and according to the coroner, it was to SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome if you forgot. Well, since Navin was basically killed by them, they reopened this case, and it was found out that the infant did not die of SIDS. He died of asphyxiation. So if you don't know what asphyxiation is, it's where the body can't get oxygen. That means the infant didn't simply stop breathing by accident. The oxygen pathway was cut off in some way, and this is where it gets suspicious. So Stephanie was with someone else before Brandon, and his name was Justin. Now that day he left for work with the baby in his bed, and in the care of Stephanie. Well, fast forward a few hours later, and 911 gets a call from Stephanie, with her claiming that her baby was unresponsive. Now, when Justin came home, he told investigators that he found Stephanie sleeping and the baby, who was named Nigel, laying face down on the couch with two cushions between his body. He also told investigators that that was not how he left him, and he had no clue on how Nigel came to be on that couch like that. Now, Justin said that the baby was quite difficult and cried a lot. He also said that Stephanie was becoming more frustrated and mad at him, but never seen or heard him. Now, look at the parallels between Nigel and Navin. They were both quite difficult kids basically, and given what Stephanie did to difficult kids, you can kind of put two and two together. And there is no way that that baby died from SIDS, given how he was positioned and the spot he was in. Now, from what I've read, they won't exhume his body, but they will be doing a reenactment with a baby doll to see if a baby could die like that. Now, I guarantee you that baby did not die on its own, but until they find out what actually happened, that's all I can say about Nigel. Now, if you're wondering, well, what happened to the older brother, he was found out to be okay and treated fairly, or at least way better than how they treated Navin. He was then given back to Laura. Now, I want to highlight how bad this case was handled, because it could have been prevented multiple times. With Nigel and the reports with DCFS, I mean, there were so many chances for Navin to be alive right now, but unfortunately, he's not. So this case started because of one unfortunate event. It started with the death of her father. A catastrophic incident had left Tommy needing several amputations, including both feet, and in 2018, he passed away due to surgical complications. But Tommy had a son named James Alex Hurley, who was 10 at this time. James was absolutely distraught about his father's passing, as they were pretty close. Now, James's mother and father didn't live together. The mother lived in Texas, with the father living in Montana. James used to live with his mother, but Alicia, who is the mother, wanted James to get to know his father better. So after Tommy's passing, the mother would hold custody of James. But since the school year had already started and Alicia didn't want James to change schools, as he would have had to move to Texas, the mother decided it was best for James to remain in Montana for the remainder of the school year. So James would go ahead and live with his grandmother and grandfather in Yellowstone, who were Patricia Bates, the grandmother, and James Sasser Sr., the grandfather. There was also their kids, James Sasser III, who was 14 at the time, Madison, who was also 14 at the time, and a 6-year-old boy named Hunter. The grandparents, or more the grandmother, were considered quite strict. She ran the house basically with an iron fist. If you didn't do what she said, there would be heavy punishments. The grandmother was controlling, bitter, and had a bad temper. She basically ran the house and was the leader of the house. So anything she said was basically law, and the grandfather would always follow her. He was damn near intimidated by her, you could say. Now, all of her traits were unfortunately passed down onto her children, so they were just like her. Now, James was allowed to be in contact with his mother, but after some time, James would tell his mother about the people living in the house. He would tell her that he missed her, missed Texas, that he didn't like the rules and the older kids were picking on him, and how he was feeling picked on in general. The grandmother would overhear this and tell Alicia that he was lying and being overdramatic. But the more times she called after that, the more Patricia would say that James was busy and couldn't come to the phone. She kept making excuses on why James couldn't talk to her, which was weird. But Alicia tried to keep things peaceful at first, as she didn't want to trigger any conflict because she was afraid that they might take it out on Alex if she caused any problems with them. She thought that because of things that Alex had told her. So instead of accusing them or starting a confrontation, she kept calling in a calm, routine way, hoping it was just all a misunderstanding or schedule issue. Although she eventually realized that she was being purposely blocked. After days of attempts, calls going straight to voicemail, messages not delivered, excuses piling up, and no access to Alex at all, she knew it wasn't an accident, nor was it a tech problem. That's when she finally understood they were intentionally preventing her from talking to her son. She then tried to get in contact with the school James was at, as that was literally the only reason he was there. But when she called the school asking about James, the school would respond with that James did not go to school there no more, and that he was taken out, and that the grandmother wanted him to be homeschooled and they had no contact with them. Although before they pulled him out of school, they did say that there was nothing wrong with James. He was just a bit quiet. After that, she tried contacting Alex's older half-siblings on her side. She reached out to people who might have contact with the grandparents or someone close to the family in Montana. But again, nobody could get through to Patricia. It was literally like they were shutting everyone out. She eventually had no way to reach Alex at all. She wasn't in the same state. She didn't have legal authority to storm into the grandparents' house, as she technically gave it over to the grandparents. She didn't know where else to call, and she didn't know why the communication had stopped. She also didn't know how bad things actually were, and they got bad. By the way, this was in late September of 2019. Now fast forward to February 3rd, 2020. The police would get a call from Patricia, and the way she spoke on that call already showed something wasn't right, because she wasn't frantic or confused or even really emotional. She told the dispatcher that her grandson was unresponsive, and she didn't know what was wrong. Which is strange in itself, because when kids suddenly collapse in front of you, most adults are panicked, yelling for help, barely able to get out words. But she spoke in that flat tone that people use when they're trying to control the situation more than they're trying to get help. When deputies and the paramedics arrived at the house on Buffalo Drive, they were expecting maybe a medical emergency or a seizure of some kind of illness. But the second they walked through the doorway, they saw James lying on the living room floor, and everything changed for them. They could see immediately that this kid wasn't someone who suddenly collapsed. His body told the story before anyone in the house even opened their mouth. He was covered in bruises, Not 1 or 2 bruises from a fall, but bruises all over his arms, his legs, his hips, his shoulders, his back, and his stomach. And the colors weren't the same, meaning they were from different days, different moments, and different incidents. Some were yellowing and healing. Others were deep purple and fresh. That's when the paramedics realized they weren't responding to a medical mystery. They were responding to months of violence. James was limp and unresponsive. They tried to resuscitate him right there on the floor, but he wasn't showing signs of coming back. They rushed him out of the house and headed for the hospital, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing else the doctors could do. James was declared dead shortly after. And that's when everything in this case exploded. Back at the house, the deputies immediately separated everyone and started asking questions, because once they saw James's condition, they knew this wasn't an accident. They started with Patricia, since she was the one who made the call. She acted confused, saying he had been acting weird the night before and that he just collapsed, and she made it seem like this came out of nowhere. She told them that he had been tired, that he was difficult, that he didn't always listen, that he just fell over and wouldn't wake up. But none of her explanations matched what the paramedics were seeing on the boy's body. Since clearly the way his body looked and how he died and how the grandmother said he died weren't adding up, this turned into a criminal investigation. Police would question everyone in the house, and right away you could see the adults trying to steer the story in the same direction. Patricia, the grandfather James Sasser Jr., and the 14-year-old uncle all pushed this idea that Alex was out of control and basically hurting himself. They told deputies that after his dad had died, his behavior got increasingly problematic, that he was stealing, drinking alcohol, hearing voices, and that he was suicidal, that he ran into furniture on purpose and caused his own injuries. They even claimed that sometime in late January, he ran himself into the corner of an entertainment center so hard that it split his head open and there was blood everywhere. They also said they had to watch him around the clock. They stayed up at night to make sure he didn't hurt himself or anyone else. The 14-year-old uncle told them about this moment on January 27th, where he said he had woken up and saw Alex standing over Patricia with a knife. So he had no choice but to tackle him and punch him over and over. On paper, they made it sound like they were defending themselves from this dangerous kid. But when you look at the reality of it, you've got a 12-year-old boy who was about 5'3" and just over 100 pounds. And then you got a 14-year-old uncle who was about 6 feet tall and close to 300 pounds. And I know this guy was fucking tall for his age and big, but he was beating on him. And nobody in that house ever bothered to call the police. Never took him to the hospital and never got him any mental health help. Nothing. Detectives couldn't find a single report in any system where this family had ever reached out for help with this erratic behavior they kept talking about. No calls to law enforcement, no psychiatric evaluations, no doctor visits for injuries, nothing to match the picture they were trying to paint. And at the same time, when they contacted Alex's mom in Texas, she told them that she had been trying to call and check on her son, and she had systematically been blocked by Patricia. So the adult stories had already had holes in it before they even got to the physical evidence. On February 4th, the day after Alex died, his body was taken to the Montana State Crime Lab in Missoula for an autopsy. The medical examiner gave detectives a preliminary read pretty quickly. Alex had died from blunt force trauma to the back of his head. That alone undercut the whole he just collapsed story, because a blow like that doesn't just appear out of nowhere. And it also didn't fit with this idea that he just sort of banged himself lightly on furniture. On top of that, the pattern of bruises, cuts, and emaciation on his body looked more like long-term abuse than a kid hurting himself once or twice. Back at the house, as they went through the scene more carefully, investigators found even more that didn't match what the family was saying. They noticed an indentation in a wall that was shaped like someone's head had been slammed into it, with a small trace of blood nearby. Later, when they used forensic tools and chemicals to check the floors and surfaces, they found evidence that there had once been a lot more blood in the living room and that it had been cleaned up, including spots where cleaning agents like vinegar had been used. Every single person in that house denied ever seeing a quote bloody bath, but one of them had already used this exact phrase with detectives to describe a previous fight on January 27th, which tells you how bad things really got. They also started digging into the electronics. Detectives seized the phones of Patricia, James Saucer Jr., Madison, and the 14-year-old uncle. And when they finally got into them, and that's when the full picture of what Alex had been going through started to show up. The videos go back at least to December 2019, which is about 2 months before they found his body. And they don't show a one-off punishment, they show a pattern. In one video from December 12th, Alex is doing forced jumping jacks while holding his butt, clearly in pain, crying, and saying he has to go to the bathroom. Instead of stopping, you can hear Patricia mocking him in the background. On January 10th, there's another video where he's near the garage door, bent over, holding his head, rocking and saying no and moaning. And then a second video 2 minutes later, where he's crying and saying, "Ow, it hurts so bad." There are multiple clips of him being forced to sit in a squat against the wall or the door, kind of like a stress position. And he's not doing it as a workout, he's crying and shaking. There's a video from January 10th on the uncle's phone where Alex is sitting against the door to the garage, crying, saying, "I hate this." And you can see a larger man hitting him with a piece of wood, a homemade paddle with blue tape on the handle. Alex is heard screaming about wanting to kill himself, and nobody steps in to comfort him or stop the assault. They just keep recording. On January 17th, there's a video that shows fresh cuts on his face and his wrists. On January 23rd, another clip shows him being pinned between the wall and the couch near the front wall of the house, arms raised above his head, shirtless with red marks on his shoulders. It looks like he keeps trying to rest his head against the window trim because he's exhausted, and Patricia can be heard yelling, "Wake up, get your head off there," and later telling him to keep his hands up and apart while he cries and says his head hurts. Her response was basically, "Who cares?" Then on January 27th, there's a video where Alex is only in his underwear, being forced to stand in front of fans in the dining room while Patricia berates him, and the 6-year-old uncle is just sitting there acting like this is normal. Another video around that same time shows him in front of the fan again, and you can hear Patricia say, "You are not even a human, you are some sort of thing." Now, when detectives went back and pulled older videos from about 2 years earlier, Alex looked completely different. He was the same kid, but then he looked healthy and fed and like a normal child. By the time he died in February 2020, they described him as emaciated. On top of that, when they searched the home, they found that a lot of the food was locked away in places James couldn't get to, like they were intentionally controlling his access to it. There were texts too. On January 17th, the 14-year-old uncle texted his dad, "I'm gonna end up killing him today." On January 27th, he was Googling what was the longest coma. And on February 2nd, the night of the Super Bowl, he was searching what are the symptoms of brain injury, concussion symptoms, and how do you tell if someone has a concussion? That's not what you search for if you think a kid just bumped his head and is fine. And it lines up with Patricia later saying January 27th was a bloodbath where her son beat Hurley pretty good. At the same time, school records showed Alex had been pulled out of school back in September 2019. And according to court documents and investigators, it looked like hardly anyone outside that house had seen him in months. The West Yellowstone school superintendent said Alex did have behavioral issues, but they were typical for a kid with ADHD and had actually improved. And there was nothing so extreme that would justify yanking him out and cutting him off from the outside world. He also said he was never told anything about Alex sexually assaulting another student, which is another thing Patricia had claimed to justify homeschooling him. Also, a neighbor later told detectives something that changed how investigators saw the entire situation. They said back in December 2019, they saw James sprint out of the house, running like he was trying to escape, before Patricia and Madison grabbed him, held onto him, and waited until 14-year-old James Saucer III caught up. The neighbor told the police Saucer III dragged Alex back toward the house and kept punching him in the face as they went, and neither adult with him tried to stop it, they just watched. There was one video that investigators described as especially disturbing, where the teenagers jumped him in the living room, and instead of stopping it, you can hear someone behind the camera laughing. And when I mean jumped him, I mean it was bad. The kids were stomping on his head, kicking his head, and just punching him everywhere. It's a really sad sight. All of that together, the condition of his body, the wall damage, the hidden blood, the locked food, the search history, and the videos, is what led the sheriff and the prosecutors to call it exactly what it was: systematic torture that built up over months and ended with blunt force trauma to the back of a 12-year-old's head, on or around February 2nd, 2022, with him being found dead on February 3rd. Within days, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office arrested Patricia Bates, James Saucer Jr., James Saucer III, and Madison for deliberate homicide. A family friend, 18-year-old Gage Roche, was also later charged with felony assault on a minor, after he was seen in one of the videos hitting Alex with the paddle. Patricia Bates, the grandmother, was sentenced to life in prison after pleading guilty to deliberate homicide in the death of James Alex Hurley. James Saucer Jr., the grandfather, was sentenced to 100 years in prison for his role in the death. The uncle, the juvenile, accepted a plea deal. Because he was a minor at the time, he was not tried as an adult. Madison got off with probation as she took a plea deal to help provide evidence against the grandmother and grandfather. Because there's no public mention, we can't say what happened to the 6-year-old. He may have been placed in protective custody, foster care with other relatives, or something else. But nothing in the public confirms that. And why the grandmother didn't want to give James back to the mother is pretty unknown, as she clearly didn't like James. But the mother thinks it was because of greed, as James was getting Social Security payments from his father's death, and the grandmother was actually taking that money for herself, but it's unconfirmed. It's heartbreaking what happened to James because one tragedy snowballed into another, and that first loss, the death of his father, pushed him into a home where things slowly turned into something no one could imagine.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.